Testing, testing.
It's the Willy Show.
Starting in five,
4, 3, 2, 1.
So, hello and welcome back to the 15th episode of the Willy Show. I'm sitting here with, a bit of a mythical legend throughout the army, and someone I'm really proud to call one of my mates, Dr. Dan Pronk, who served in the SAS on tours overseas, been a medical physician throughout, and a mate of mine who's come on the scene pretty early on in my treatment to help me out. And you actually you got the ball rolling massively on my Instagram. I still remember it. I had like 400 followers, and then you were like, hey, let's raise a toast to Willy. Like, you wouldn't leave him overseas by himself. Let's not let him fight cancer by himself. Next thing, like, I didn't even know you at this point. Well, I knew who you were. And I'm like, what the fuck? Next thing, just influx. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on? So thank you, Dan, for coming on. And hey, mate, cheers for coming.
Mate, it's an absolute privilege to be here. I'm glad that we've had this opportunity to get together, and gee, it's fantastic to hear that and to hear that I was able to help out in a small way with the social media piece.
Oh, bro, it was a big way. Honestly, it was a big way. And the most stupid thing I've done with yourself was on a tire flip. I fucking did not recognise you at all because I hadn't met you before.
Well, nor should you, mate.
I didn't recognise you. I was like, I'd seen your photos overseas of you with a fucking mohawk and cammed up, and then you're like, hey man, I'm like, hey bro, like what's up? like I'm flat out. And then I was like, that's Dan Pronk. I'm like, oh no shit.
It's not like that at all. I mean, and you were very busy. You're the celebrity, mate. You're the celebrity on that day. You organised that whole thing, and
it was a good day.
Yeah. So it's that was great to come along to that. It was a fantastic turnout and a great event.
Oh, bro, it was. And I thank you for a lot of help on that too. Yeah. So I guess the first we're going to go over. Look, I have been reading Dan's book. Dan's had a new book go out called The Average 70 Kilogram Dickhead, which is available anywhere, including if you inbox Dan. He'll send you, or inbox me and I'll send you a link. So we'll sort of go over, I guess you go over a lot in that of you growing up and sort of your aspirations at the time when you were younger of wanting to be a triathlete. And where did that actually stem from?
That it's a good question. I can't pinpoint the exact sort of period in my life where I decided, hey, I want to do this. I was not really an athletic kid at all growing up. I was just a little bit of a chubby kid, played a bit of cricket here and there, and just at a moderate medium level at school and whatever else. And then in my middle to late high school, for whatever reason, I started taking an interest in running and showed a bit of proficiency at middle distance running, and really got bitten by that bug. I loved it, loved my middle distance running, 1500s and miles. And as I progressed out of school, I started doing a couple of triathlons.
Yeah.
And as a junior triathlete, started to show a little bit of promise there and quite enjoyed it. And so when I got out of school, I decided I'd move my life down to the Gold Coast, which at the time I was up in Queensland. At the time was a bit of a hub for triathlon. That was the mid-90s. And just started taking it really seriously and looking towards trying to make a career of it.
Yeah. And that was, you would have been pretty late teens at that point.
Yes, exactly. So late teens into my early 20s.
And you say that you enjoyed sort of the middle distance and exercising in general. Do you find it's the outcome of the exercising, like what you get out of it, or you sort of enjoy the bit of the pain while doing the challenge?
I guess it's all of the above. I mean, people talk about that getting into the zone and that flow state that the students of psychology out there will recognise as Csikszentmihalyi. I only just recently learnt how to say that guy's name. Csikszentmihalyi was a social psychologist that looked at the flow state, that state where you kind of get in the zone and you lose track of time and who you are, and you're really absorbed in an activity of any description. I found that with running. I found it to be, when I got into it, a sort of form of moving meditation, if you like. And I guess at the stages of my life where I've been particularly fit and when I was running fit, just that complete feeling of freedom when you're running at a good pace, a good fast pace, sort of around that. Well, for me at the time, it was sort of down around that 3-minute K pace. You're moving along at good
No, you're
speed.
fucking getting along at 3-minute Ks,
well,
yeah.
Oh, it's a long time ago now, mate. I think a 30-minute K would be a stretch for me now. But you're working, you're physically working to your maximum, right on that limit of that anaerobic threshold. And the 1500 was a great race where you had enough time to get into that rhythm and hit it, and then push yourself home hard and just hit the line completely spent. And then, like you say, that, I guess, shot of endorphins and all the other feel-good chemicals that you get out of a hard physical workout just reinforce that behaviour and leave you feeling good.
Fucking oath. And it's nice. You say get in the zone. It's actually nice when I think it takes a lot of learning to enjoy what you do to actually get in that zone. Like, no one starts running and gets in that zone off the bat. It doesn't happen. It happens over weeks, months, could be years of people. Yeah. And I distinctively remember getting in that zone running, and I loved it.
Yeah.
Like, there was a point in my life I was running 100 to 120 Ks a week, year 12.
Wow, that's big mileage.
Slow, but but I was training for nothing. I literally, like, early year 12, late year 11, read the book Born to Run.
Yeah.
And just, I was like, fuck, this is what I want to do. And and literally, once you get in that zone with exercise, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think any skill, and when you look at the literature coming back to that flow state and those states where you can kind of, no matter what the outlet is, be it woodwork or cooking or playing chess or computer games or going for a run or base jumping or whatever else, and looking at that, just testing your level of proficiency and challenging yourself. Yeah. So it's all about doing an activity just above the level of your comfortable proficiency and sort of pushing yourself. They talk about working 4% above your level of proficiency is where you're likely to enter into that zone without being overwhelmed by the complexity of it. And I suppose from a running perspective, just running at that edge of as fast as you can without pushing into that anaerobic space where you can't maintain it. And yeah, it's a good place to be.
Yeah, I guess it takes a lot of doing that particular exercise to actually get to the point where you know where that is, that teetering point. Yeah, a lot of people go for a run, fucking flog it, and then some you're too slow. But yeah, it's incredible. And you looked a lot differently at the time. You describe in your book that you had long hair and like an earring, and I was imagining it like, really? Like, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I should put a photo up on Instagram. There's a couple of good ones that I like actually from around that time. And at that stage, my brother had entered into the army, and he was going through ADFA and Duntroon, and before he went on to his infantry and then SAS career. And so I had no intention of joining the army at that point. It was the furthest thing from my mind. And I used to go to his parades down at ADFA and RMC with my shoulder length hair, and I had dreadlocks at one stage. I don't think ever when I went to one of those parades, and an earring, and just the irony of it was not lost on me when I was watching them do all their parades and just sort of bemused watching them all parading around clean cut in unison. And then years later, I found myself on that same parade ground thinking, how did this happen? Like, I just never would have imagined. But yeah,
that's quite incredible. And you go over in your book as well a lot about, like, I think some people, and it's pretty common these days to have a bit of a sap story of like, oh, I had it hard growing up. And I really remember a point where you're like, look, we had it. We weren't the richest. Like, I didn't grow up in a house with massive pillars and a Ferrari, but there was nothing. I had wants, but I never was struggling for the needs.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's and I try and make that point quite clear. This isn't a book about overcoming adversity or anything like that. I was a product of an average middle class Australian family and grew up in a stable family unit, very, very comfortable, and one brother and a cat, and mum and dad stayed together. And so, I had a really, with hindsight, you don't know when you're a kid, of course, but then you look back and we had a great upbringing. It was really privileged. My parents had enough money to put us through private schools and things like that. And so, like you say, I mean, there's always going to be wants. I don't think it matters how rich you are. You're always going to have that, but there certainly wasn't needs in our upbringing.
Yeah. And you think that had a big influence on where you've ended up today?
Yeah, well, I guess for any of us, the product of like where we are at any given time is the product of nature and nurture to that point, of course. And I look back, and it's only as a mature adult that I could ever really realise the input that my parents had, particularly my dad, had on me growing up. And once again, you don't appreciate that relationship at the time, because as any kid does, as you get into those teenage years, you know, blokes, I think, particularly lock horns with their dads, and I was no different. And looking back now, I was making some lifestyle choices that must have really just absolutely infuriated my old man. Like, he was an army officer. He was a commanding officer of an aviation regiment. He's a helicopter pilot.
Yeah, you had a photo up of that on your Instagram. Yeah, it's cool as fuck.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, let's see.
With Bob Hawke.
I actually want to see if we can bring this up. For those of you watching the podcast, we're watching the stream. Let me go across onto here. He was with Bob Hawke, wasn't he?
Yeah,
this
there
one.
It is. Yeah, there's the old man.
That's cool as fuck. And he's got the same sunnies on his goose on the wall back here.
Yep. Got the aviators going on and the mow. Yeah, the old man, you know, God rest his soul, he passed away a couple of years back. But he, with hindsight, he's, I suppose most people will say this about their dad, but I mean, he was a brilliant human being and a great role model, and I miss him dearly. But I look back now and I think of all the traits that he had that made him a fantastic human being, and I was lucky enough to inherit a few of them with hindsight, and I hope I can be the dad to my kids that he was to us.
Yeah, and that's a pretty moving thing, man.
Yeah.
That's quite incredible. You sort of blown me away with that. Yeah, good on you. He's looks like a fucking legend.
Oh,
Same
he was,
as,
mate.
same as
Yeah,
Bob Hawke.
and as we grew up, I mean, that whole dynamic of locking horns as kids, and coming back to that, I mean, he was as this military commanding officer, you know, running an aviation regiment, and here I was as this punk kid with, you know, before I got into the whole running thing, I was just, well, even after, I was racing around on skateboards and spray painting trains and just sort of involved in listening to hip hop and wearing baggy pants and all that sort of stuff. And so the old man, God bless him, it must have absolutely ground his shit to see his kid doing that, but he didn't let on. He let me go through all those phases and sort of find who I was in the world, and then eventually kind of come around and ironically ended up in the army just like he did. So.
Yeah. But it's important, I guess, to give your kids a bit of let them make their own mistakes. You know, be their own person.
You got it.
And we'll see how they go.
Yeah.
And I can relate to locking horns with your dad.
Yeah.
But now we're closer than ever. But I think it's because we've got so many similarities. Things that pissed me off that he did, I do directly, because we're so similar.
Mate. I see my dad in me with my kids now, you know, the good and the bad points. Well, when I say bad, I mean the points that I perceived as bad when I was a kid. But the same stuff that he used to bark at us for, I'm now barking at my kids. And I suppose it's inevitable. I mean, I guess I'm genetically half him, so you sort of somewhat programmed to inherit some of their traits.
Yeah, for sure. And your brother, it's Ben, isn't it?
Ben, yeah.
Yeah, so right. a quick plug, actually. Ben's podcast is called The Unforgiving 60. So it's run by Ben, and I can't remember the other guy's name for the law.
Tim Curtis.
Ben and Tim Curtis, that's it.
Yeah.
Both have Masters of Business and ex-SAS, both of them.
Correct.
And some of their podcasts are fantastic, like the one with Matt Hall that just did.
Yeah.
The Red Bull Air Race / fighter pod. Fucking epic. So if anyone who's looking for something like that, or stay on this one, but then eventually go over there. Just rate me a little bit higher than that. No, I'm on. Ben's lovely. I was talking to him the other day.
Yeah.
Did Ben grow up very similarly to you as far as rebel a bit, or did he a bit more straight and narrow?
We took fairly different paths, and so when we were in our early high school years, my dad knew that he was going to be posting back to Oakey out in southeastern Queensland, out from Toowoomba, and so the way it ended up transpiring, they'd wanted us to do all our high schooling at a single high school.
Yep.
And so Ben went off to boarding school for the first couple of years of that while we stayed in Brisbane. And so we were sort of separated at that point. He was off at boarding school and I was in school in Brisbane, finishing my primary school, did my first year of high school in Brisbane. And then I guess, once again, like a lot of brothers growing up, we were best mates as kids, and then as we got into our teenage years and started to try and find our own identity, we sort of locked horns as well. So we weren't the best of mates throughout our teenage years, but then sort of came right back together as best mates, once we'd left school and started to become young adults. But no, he kind of had a more he was very focused on being military from a very early age. It was clear he was right into his school cadets. You know, every childhood photo of him, pretty much, he used to have this little toy M16, and he carried this fucking thing around with him constantly. So, with hindsight, the writing was on the wall for him that he was going to be military and infantry, and so he went down that pathway and did very well at school. You know, highly intelligent bloke. It pains me to say it on air, but very,
we'll bleep that bit out.
Censor that bit out. But very clever guy and very focused. Did very well at school and got a scholarship to the Defence Force Academy, and so was streamlined into that. Yeah,
that's one thing that I'll fucking sort of give you and Ben. Fuck your overachievers.
Oh, cheers.
Like we take the piss all the time, but behind your back we're going, he can't be a doctor and in the SAS. Fuck off. Like, you can have one or the other. Stop having both. Oh, mate, we're out here struggling to do the dishes.
It's been a really privileged run, and it's sort of not lost on me that.
But it's hard work involved too. It's not just handed.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, the opportunities that I've had available to me that I've been able to take everything's lined up really well. And I look back and certainly it's you know, I can see that the stuff that I've had afforded to me has been really, really sort of privileged. I mean, even to the point of being in certain units at the time when Afghanistan was going on, because you look at nowadays, the people rolling through the same jobs that I did don't have those same opportunities to go and do the job on the ground, and it's just timing. So, there was a lot of luck involved and a lot of good role models, good mentors, and good opportunities.
Oh, for sure, 100%. And I think you really discuss a lot about, you know, your privilege being, you know, you're so lucky to be in a family like that. Same as there's one of the swimmers, big tall bloke, big feet. He's like, oh, what's your secret swimming? I chose my parents well. But you talk a lot about privilege. But one of the things that becomes very apparent from your book, and I had to almost have a bit of almost reevaluate myself and sort of my values, was you're big on trying to help some people that may be not underprivileged but haven't been sort of handed the same opportunities you may have had in your life. That you try it where you can, whether it's from a monetary value or, you know, having a chat with someone. I think you really try and do that. And the bit that really hit me was when you're discussing that, you know, you were outside of the opening of a fancy restaurant and you're with your newly born child and everything's, you know, the stars are going fucking beautifully for you. And a guy asked you for some money for the bus and you open your wallet, first thing you saw was $100.
Yeah.
And you gave it to him and he thought you were taking the piss. And you talk about a lot of, you know, giving money to people on the side of the road that may be homeless. And you discuss a lot about, well, I don't care what they do with that money and it's their decision. It's not, once I've given it to them, it's out of my hands. And I think that actually took me a bit of my own pride to swallow and sort of reevaluate things. And I think it's good to get an umbrella of terms to, you know, to see where you lie. But yeah, I think it's a fantastic thing of you trying to help people where you can to get, you know, a little bit more help, bit of privilege.
Yeah, no, cheers for saying that. And once again, coming back to my dad, that was something that we as a family watched him do in our youth. You know, it was standard practice for Dad to try and help people out. And it's been fascinating to meet people as an adult that interacted with my dad or were subordinates of my dad in the army units that he worked with and learn of him through their eyes. And the common theme was that he was very giving, he was very selfless, very fair and firm, you know, but by that same token was always keen to try and help someone who wasn't able to help themselves, you know, go into bat for the digger that couldn't go into bat for themselves if it was warranted. And you know, I mentioned it in the book. I think that we used to. It was when I was a kid. It was back in the days where hitchhiking was pretty common.
Given,
yes,
there's no Uber
everywhere. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so we'd often be on long road trips. The old man would pick up hitchhikers, and then when they got out at the other end, he'd give them all the money in his wallet. And it was just this. So that was what we grew up with. That, and he could recognise that they needed the cash more than he did. And I think it's been fantastic having that role model growing up, but then also having the opportunity through the army to go and spend time in the third world, to go and look at what Timor looks like, Southeast Asia, New Guinea, Afghanistan, and you look at it gives you this whole changed perspective on just how lucky we are.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, as I've already mentioned, I realise how lucky I am personally and professionally to be in a role where society dictates that a doctor gets paid well, you know. And so I think the very least you can do is try and acknowledge that some people have not had the same opportunities, oftentimes through no fault of their own. They've been set on a trajectory that just didn't allow them to thrive in life. And so if there's a chance to help those people out in some small way to improve their life, even for a small period of time, then, you know, you got to do that, because this is not a big deal. And that's I mean, I smile when I hear you talk about that story, and I can remember that so vividly, that giving those blokes that cash. And for me now, that's 10 years ago, more than our eldest son's 11 now. So it's, but I remember it vividly, and it makes me smile now, you know. And it's sort of people spend $100 all the time, and you forget about what you spend it on. But that $100 is, as I've got more than $100 worth out of that. Enjoy.
Exactly. And that was actually going to be the next point on it. You mentioned, I can't remember the $100 before that. I can't remember the $100 after that. But for the rest of my life, I'll remember that $100. And I think that's a quite incredible thing. And sometimes those small things actually end up being so influential in your life.
Oh,
you know, for you it's $100. It's not that much money. For them though, that's massive. It could be massive for them. But the impact that small gift that you've given has changed your whole, has almost reconfirmed our outlook on life for you. Yeah.
And look, I mean, we're talking about cash here, but you think about the small, like non-financial, like just a gift of your time, or giving someone some advice if they ask for it, or touching base, you know. And I think of when those small offerings from significant people in my life as I've gone along, and how much they meant to me. And one that always comes to mind when I think of that, there's a bloke by the name of Richard Villa, who is a doctor over in the UK, and he was a doctor with the British SAS, with 22 SAS, around the time of the Falklands War and the Iranian embassy siege, that kind of era. And when I had my eyes open to special operations, decided that I wanted to be a doctor with the SAS, I reached out to this bloke. Like, I looked online to see if there was someone who'd done this. I found this guy, and he'd written a book. I got his book and you know, read it cover to cover in a day, and then found an email contact for him online, and sent him an email basically saying, don't expect to hear from you. However, here's who I am, here's what I want to do, read your book, loved it, you've done everything I want to do, and didn't think anything of it. Within 24 hours, I get a reply from this guy, and so he's a orthopedic surgeon now. He's well out of the military and gone on to do orthopedics, works at Cambridge in the UK. He's a really high profile consultant surgeon. And here's this guy getting an email from a nobody halfway across the world who's got this pipe dream of joining the SAS as a doctor, and he takes the time to reply to me, and sort of, it was a really gracious reply. It was really encouraging, and I printed that thing out and carried it with me for 6 years while I trained for selection. It was in my kit, and I read it over and over and over. And actually, I just dragged it out the other day. I was thinking of it, so I mean, to him that was 30 seconds to tap out a reply, but to me that was sort of years that I used that as fuel for my enthusiasm.
It's important to have things like that. And I'd actually put that time is a lot more valuable than money. And you and me were discussing earlier offline that, you know, money comes and goes. It does. Yeah. Time, you're never getting that back.
No.
It's gone.
Yeah.
And, you know, for someone to actually ask to volunteer their time or donate their time, you know, you should really be appreciative of it. If someone comes and helps you out, you know, fuck, it's a lot. It's a fucking lot. And I think we actually underestimate, you know, look at guys like volunteer firefighters and stuff. They don't have to be there. They're doing it for free.
Their blood's worth bottling. Yeah.
Fucking oath.
Yeah, that was, speaking of that sort of gift of time, and the other real, really sort of gratifying experiences that I've had along the way, along this similar line, is some of the times in third world countries where I've been able to use a medical skill set, which is pretty basic stuff by our standards, but in the third world can make a huge difference to do just that, to make a really significant difference to someone's life. And I mean, it's not money; it's a little bit of your time and a little bit of kit, but in those contexts, it can make a massive difference. And just that, you can't put a dollar value on that.
No, not at all. And like you discuss, rural Afghanistan, a father, clearly distressed, brought in his child, young boy, I think, from memory, who had a was it stuck in his ear?
Yeah, I reckon if you scroll down here, you might
scroll
find
down.
a picture
Okay,
of that
let's
maggot. You're right.
There was a maggot in his ear.
Yeah,
Let's,
that's it. He was bleeding from his ear. He was in all sorts of pain, and the kid and the dad were quite distressed.
Yeah, and I think that donation, for you, if I came into your clinic tomorrow with that, or if I came to, it'd be, Willy would grab out a pair of tweezers and pull it out. No big deal. But over there, fucking antibiotics don't exist for them. And when you were able to, administer antibiotics and take it out and relieve the pain, it changes lives.
Yeah, it was a small effort on.
Oh, who's this good-looking rooster here?
Oh, there he is.
I'm up here. Yeah, I've made your profile.
Thing. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right, so multiple times.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not in
Maybe
there.
it's not. Oh, we'll find it. We'll find it at some point. Yeah, but I think that donation, that one really rings true.
Yeah.
And you have a quote in your book that I really love as well about and you'll actually know I don't know it off by heart, but it's like you haven't lived until you've done something for someone they can never repay you.
Yeah.
And it's true.
Yeah.
Like that kid could never feasibly come and hey, thank you, Dr. Pronk, for doing that. You changed my life, potentially saved my life. But nor would you ever look for that. Of course you wouldn't. But doing something for that, it can really change you.
Well, yeah, you're spot on. And I guess the difference between doing a good deed for someone with the agenda of having them owing you type thing is a very different beast to that completely sort of with no intent of seeing anything in return, doing a good deed for someone. And I think that's where that real, I guess for me, feeling of self-worth comes in. And if you're in a position where you might have a skill set, or you might have a few spare bucks, or you might have some time on your hands to be able to help someone else out with no agenda of getting anything in return, then that's the good stuff right there. That's what it's all about.
I can know that. It helps, yourself out too.
What
you can take away from it. You're like, well, actually, kid, I know you did this, but fuck, it's made a big impact on my life.
Yeah, and you're spot on, and I guess you could see it from a somewhat selfish perspective in that regard, because it is. I guess those that know the pleasure of doing those things, I guess they get it. And I suppose you get these massive philanthropists around the world that have got all the money in the world, and they spend millions, if not billions of dollars on these projects where they don't expect to see anything in return. And I guess that's the large scale of this concept that we're talking of. Yeah,
and I think on a smaller scale, like from my own thing, is my fundraising and everything for cancer. I 100% know there is no research around the world going into the tumour I've got.
Yeah.
But it's not that I don't care about my self-worth, but what I struggle with is kids with cancer. And I'm like, well, at one point, even if it's, tens of thousands of dollars, somewhere down the line, this will help someone else out. And I'm fine never to know who they are. And I don't want to ever know who they are. But yeah, that's helped me a lot. A lot of people are, why do you put so much effort into fundraising for nothing of your own return? I'm like, bullshit. Yeah. I would have gone fucking crazy if I hadn't done this. Yeah. Because otherwise I would have lived, died, and not done anything for, what I've got. But at the end of the day, it actually does a lot for me. And I have a lot of people like, hey, thanks for doing your Instagram. I'm like, no, thanks for following me, because if you follow me, that actually helps me a shitload get in myself thinking, well, my story is worth something and I'm worth something. And it helps me a shitload. And I think it's sort of true between both of us with, small things like that.
Oh, for sure, mate. And I imagine the amount of people, and what you're doing is an unbelievable thing. Like I suspect the majority of people in your situation would assume that victim, that why me, that sort of I'm going to sit in a dark room and drink whiskey, as opposed to sitting in a bright room with whiskey right now drinking whiskey. But you know what I mean. There's two different ways you can go, and you've taken that probably somewhat harder road to get out there, say, hey, here's me, here's what I've got. this sucks. However, I'm not going to be the victim. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get proactive and start to, I guess, and I can't think of the exact quote, but there's a quote relating to planting seeds, even though the tree's going to take 100 years to grow and you'll never see it. But, you know,
I know what you mean. Yeah,
exactly what you're talking about, the raising money now, even though the fruits of that research may not be for 20, 30 years or whatever else. But I mean, unless there's people like you getting out in the public space and raising awareness and raising cash and bringing up the profile, then nothing's ever going to happen. And so
I agree. I think from memory, the quote something like, "To live is to plant a seed of a tree you'll never sit under," or something like that.
Sounds profound. Yeah,
it might be something like that. I just made that shit up.
I'll go with
and
it.
Quote me with that.
Well, I will. Yeah.
No, but it's helped me a lot, and I think, you know, playing victim of something, I actually, you know, you say it might be the harder, on the surface, it may be the harder thing to share your story and everything, like you do on your Instagram and everything, you know, share these good and bad experiences. But I actually think it might be harder on the surface and it's a lot easier than to actually be a victim sitting in a dark room. Like, playing victim, like the long-term effect is so big, like the ripples onto everyone. Like, I think playing victim is one of the biggest things we have that just doesn't work. Yeah,
no, it doesn't. And I guess not all people that are playing victim are doing it as a conscious decision.
Oh, no, of course not.
But you're right. I mean, it's not productive, and in fact, it's very destructive getting caught in that victim mentality and that sort of downward spiral of that goes with it. But yeah, no, I think you're doing a great job, mate. I suspect there's probably, for every one person that reaches out and tells you you're an inspiration, which I imagine there's a whole bunch. I imagine there's another 5 or 10 that sit there looking, thinking, you know what, fucking hell, that bloke's doing all of this despite having brain cancer. I'm going to get off the couch and do something. And you'll never hear from them, but I suspect you're influencing thousands of people you don't even know about, mate.
I'd like to think so. And that's, we sort of talk on giving back. And that's why I've got this whole thing of I reply to every message anyone ever sends me. Like, if you've taken the time to actually write to me, I don't care if it's a "Hey, what's up?" or it's a big spiel on something going on in your life, that, you know, I will endeavour at least to reply. I will reply. It just might take a while, but I will reply to you, because it's like, well, you've given your time. My time's not better than yours, not at all. We have the same fucking timelines. And I'll try and do it. And you know, it's coming now to more of Q&As and stuff on, because it's a lot quicker for me to do. But I love it, man. I think it's. I get so much out of it. It's selfish in that way. I get more of it than I think I give back.
Oh, I'm with you, and I guess and social media, I suppose it's a weird beast, and there's so many false metrics and all the rest of it. But I agree with you. It's about that interaction, and if someone is going to take the time to engage with something you've put on social media and send you a message, then, you know, it's your obligation to try and get back to them. And geez, I'm with you. I'd try to as best I can.
Yeah, as best you can. Yeah, it's a weird thing. Social media used correctly is the best tool ever.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It
fucking
can be a real demon, but it can also be an awesome tool. And I suppose it depends on how you use it and how you interact with people. And
well, you've got what, 46,500 followers. Once you start posting up like some booty photos and bikini stuff, that'll triple on Instagram, won't it?
That'll trim them down, mate. Yeah, that'll get me back down to single figures.
Have you seen a big, because I know you're, like, that's a fucking big profile and you're pretty active on it. Have you seen, you know, a lot of stuff in your story be told more from your socials?
Look, it's sort of done what I wanted it to do and then some. The initially, and I guess coming out of a military environment, and particularly the special operations environment, where we didn't have any social media profiles, it just wasn't the done thing to then. And also that mentality that surrounds special operations, that secrecy and all the rest of it, which is quite rightly there. Yeah, it was a pretty sort of, I guess, foreign concept and uncomfortable concept. Some of it was influenced by promoting TACMed, which is a company that I co-own and serve as the medical director for, and there was some utility in building a social media profile to promote TACMed, to get some articles out there, some blog posts in various sites out there. And what I was hoping to achieve, and I'd like to think I have continued to achieve with the social media, is just trying to take some of the lessons learnt over the years that had either been imparted on me, or I'd learnt the hard way, or I'd seen someone else do, or I'd seen done well or poorly, and try and package that up and convey it to someone out there who might have utility for it, who might be able to read it and learn something before they experience something I did, or what have you. And so I guess that was the goal behind my social media and behind sort of scribbling out that book, was to just try and take all this stuff that's happened and some of these fairly rich experiences, both good and bad, and a bunch of the lessons learnt, and get that out there and just engage with people. And so, I mean, it's achieved that. It's been good. It was never designed with anything other than that in mind, and then it's just sort of grown. It seems to have resonated with a few people. And
well, fucking earth, like if you look up there, there's 88 of people I follow you. Like it's a fucking a big community thing, man. Fucking
and it's good too, isn't it? I mean, it's good. I guess a lot of our followers would be the similar people that are interested in that same kind of ethos and vibe that we're putting out there.
Yeah, and I guess too of yours is you're never like, oh, this is the right way. It's almost presenting things of like, well, this is how I've done something. You can disagree or agree, but I'm just presenting things, and you can take whatever stance on it that you like.
And I think that's important. I think there's very few things in life that have got one set way of doing things. And this is something, actually, I was having this discussion just a couple of weeks ago with a good mate of mine who's an instructor with one of the police force groups, talking about some tactical medical stuff, and he was asking a question. And there is some stuff in tactical medicine that's clear cut. If this happens, you do this. Don't ask any questions. However, there's so many things where it's like, well, should you do this? Should you do that? And I think it's the instructors that get up and just rigidly say, here's how you should do it because that's how I've always done it. It's narrow-sighted, and it's not the best way of going about it. And people are clever, they'll either see straight through that, or they'll want to know if there's other options. And so I guess the better bet in that situation, from my perspective, is you explain the underlying, in that instance, the underlying wounding mechanism. You say, hey, here's what's going on. If you do this, that might happen, and it might go wrong this way. However, if you do it that way, that might happen this way. So it's all situation dependent. You can try that. If it doesn't work, try this, rather than saying you will do that. And then the kind of flow chart ends there. And then if that doesn't work, you've got nowhere to go from there.
Yeah, fucking hell. It's actually really understand it, I guess. Understanding, it's not steps in place. It's actually understanding what it is doing.
You're spot on. If you can understand the underlying mechanism, then you can problem solve the solution, rather than just having a sort of idiot's guide, this happens, do that, and then if it doesn't work, you got nowhere to go. Yeah,
I remember probably one of my biggest examples of that was in like maths, in like year 12 maths. So I did like maths methods and further. I did two different ones. One was like your basic tertiary, and one was like the step up. And the funny thing was, the actual equation answers were pretty much the same stuff. But one, you just learn, plug this in, you'll get this. The other is, well, this is actually how you work that out. And one, you understand, you'll get the same way. But if something goes wrong on that, you're fucked. You will never know where you've gone. Yeah. And it's true, especially with things like medicine. My very, very basic, like I've done CFA and then AMT, and that's it. You're still a lot more experienced than, just a first aider, who've done down bloody school. And fucking really enjoyed it, actually. But
it's good stuff, isn't it?
It's fantastic. But knowing the processes of it makes you so much better at it.
Yeah.
And it's something I think we should almost touch on more, I guess, in sort of our role, is actually first aid stuff.
Yeah.
Because it helps in all walks of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fucking A. So, sort of bringing it back, you're joining Army. You go through that. You're at a barbecue, I'm presuming with your brother, with a bunch of SAS, like current or serving SAS guys at the time.
Yeah.
Whilst you're in med school.
Yes.
And that's sort of where your interest peaked in, shit, this is what I want to fucking train for.
Yeah.
But I've still got a long time.
Yes.
How did that all come about?
So I was in the Army by then. So the triathlon thing had fallen through, and I'd done a degree part-time up on the Gold Coast. I did an exercise science degree.
Yep.
So I had a degree which really didn't open many doors in at that time. Didn't really want to work in that world. The triathlon had fallen through, had to work out what I was doing with my life. So my girlfriend at the time said, go and do this GAMSAT test, which was the Graduate Australian Medical School admission test. And anyway, I ended up going and doing that. I got a mark good enough to apply for medical school. At the same time, I was starting to look at the Army. My brother had gone into the Army. Dad was Army. And I was starting to think, hey, you know what? Maybe the Army's not a bad option. And so had started that process. Got a score good enough to go interview for med school, got an interview for med school, got into that, found out that the Army had a scholarship scheme to put people through medical school, to fund it. Applied for that, got that, and so went off to med school. So in 2001, I kicked that off. End of '01, of course, as everyone will remember, was when the Twin Towers fell. And so September 11 kicked off the whole Afghan campaign. And at that stage, my brother, he'd gone through his ADFA, done Troon, done some infantry time as a junior infantry officer, and done SAS selection, had gone across to SASR. And he was gearing up to go over with one of the early Australian special operations contingents to Afghanistan in the very early days.
That's very early, yeah.
Yeah. So I think from memory, Australia pushed a group out the door in as early as November or October, November. It was very shortly after those events. And then my brother was gearing up with what I think was the second gig that was going early the following year, early 2012. And so I'd gone over, 2002, I'd gone over right at the end of '01 to just say hi to him and sort of before he went off to Afghanistan. And I don't think I had any idea that the SAS really existed at that point, to be honest with you. I must have been vaguely aware because somewhere in the mix I'd read Bravo 20 and The One That Got Away. So I mean, the British SAS, obviously, but only just because I found the book somewhere. I was in between two triathlons, actually, between Sydney and Canberra. I had a week to kill, and someone gave me the book and I read it. But with regards to the Australian SAS, really didn't have any great insight. Went over and spent a little bit of time out on the base there, having a look at what that was all about, and met some of the blokes. And I was at that barbecue, which was just my brother's troop was having a barbecue, and so met some of those guys. And the actual bloke who kind of was talking to me and gave me that light bulb moment that I got to be a part of this was a bloke by the name of Keith Fennell. Who's Fenno, who's
wrote Warrior Brothers and Warrior Training.
That's exactly right.
Got them somewhere sitting around,
Yeah, so it was Fenno. So he was a member of my brother's troop for that trip and was just having a yarn to him. And he was the one that said, you should do selection and come across to the unit. And I said, oh, no. I basically said to him, no, I'm on this scholarship. I'm going to be a doctor. He said, yeah, do it and come across as a qualified doctor. And it was like a switch flicked in my mind. I'm like, holy shit, yes, that's what I want to do. And it was a great way of since I'd sort of failed in the triathlon thing, which was of course very physical. It was a great environment to be in. It was this lofty goal that just simply wasn't good enough to achieve. But I'd gone off to med school, and med school was very stimulating from a mental perspective, but I had that void for a physical challenge in my life and an ambitious goal. I mean, other than med school, that was a pretty bloody ambitious.
Yeah, it's ambitious
goal
enough.
for me.
Yeah, fucking hell.
But I mean, it didn't quite sort of scratch the itch for there's still that physical piece that I felt the need to try and strive towards. And so the whole SAS selection thing was the perfect goal to fill that void. Yeah. So yeah, that was what kind of lit that fuse.
And that became a long-term goal too for you. Yeah, over a period of 6 years, I believe. It wasn't like, it wasn't
7 even.
7, yeah. Like it wasn't like, I mean, here we go. I'm on. Selection's not like that. You don't decide you're doing it and then do it.
Well, no, I mean, normally
like you decide you can decide you're doing it, but you can't do it the next day.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I recall that I went back after that Christmas period, and then the following year, as soon as everyone came back on deck from a military perspective, I rang up the Special Forces Training Centre who manages all the selection courses, and got the rep there and said, hey, look, I want to do SAS selection. He's like, oh yeah, no worries, who are you? And I told him who I was, told him I was in med school, and asked if I could come and do the course. Yeah. And he said, look, appreciate your enthusiasm, but no, you can't finish your medical degree. And which was of course the right thing to say. It was a silly request on my behalf. And then I phoned a few years later and they told me the same thing. And so Yeah, I ended up needing to finish my medical school. So I did 4 years of med school and then 2 years as a junior doctor. My 1 year of induction courses in the Army. So my first Army posting, the first year was pretty much all your induction courses to become deployable as a military doctor. And then the year after that, I finally got the chance to go and do the course.
Yeah, well, it's fucking epic.
Yeah.
And before we jump into the course, you speak a lot about, and we're talking about this before, of not, although you set out things to achieve, it's all right also to not reach those goals. And you actually break down really well about, breaking down what you want to achieve and how to get there. And your example is, well, how do you eat an elephant? It's one mouthful at a time.
Yep.
And that's true.
Yeah.
How do you pass selection? Well, it can only be so long, and that's it. Like you've got to do that. Of course, there's nothing I've done, but you're breaking it down to those, little bits.
Yep.
But you also break down, and I think we lose a bit of this sometimes. It's not failing to not reach your goal. You didn't fail as a triathlete because you never became, professional Ironman. Of course, you didn't fail. And we were talking about it before that. There's certain things like the whole reason I joined defence was because I wanted to do selection and go through. I haven't had a failure of a career because I've never got to do it. Well, exceptional circumstances haven't allowed that.
Yep.
It's the same with plenty of things. And that doesn't mean that's a failure. It just means something's gone wrong. And you talk about that as well with things in your book as like, it's all right to lose and gain interest in different aspects.
Yep.
And we'll go over, and this is something I actually didn't know. If you went through selection course and then you actually got picked up onto Rio, got injured, or you had something, what was it? Something, an infection or something.
I did. So what ended up happening, and it was a convoluted sort of pipeline after that.
Yeah.
I'd been with 5 RAR, so an infantry battalion up in Darwin at the time, and 5 was due to deploy to East Timor, Timor-Leste, at the end of the year that I did selection. And so what had happened was the selection course was midway through the year. It was sort of July, August from memory. And the deployment was going in October or something along those lines. And so I'd applied for selection. My commanding officer needed to approve that application for me to go off on selection. And so he was quite within his rights. So he knew that I was the doc for the unit and should be the doctor to go and deploy to Timor. He signed off on my form and to this day, and I've actually had the opportunity to thank him since, but to this day I'm thankful that he would have been quite within his rights to say, no, sorry, we need you for this operational tour. You're not going. And that would have been perfectly appropriate and probably the right thing to do, but he didn't. He was a fantastic guy and he could see that I was sort of really motivated to go and do selection. But so he said, yes, absolutely, you can go do the course. I'll try and replace you for the trip, but if I can't, you're going to need to come back and deploy with the task group. And so that was the agreement when I left 5RAR to go and do selection. Did selection, got through, started Rio. They couldn't find another doctor to replace my position for the trip, and so I got called back to Darwin. So got bumped off my Rio course to go back to my unit to deploy. But what you're talking about, I'd got this infection, so I had an infected blister on selection that within about 3 or 4 days of the end of the course, my leg was blown up like a balloon and I couldn't bend the knee. And I knew it was cellulitic, it was infected, but I was so far along, I was right there. I knew if I sang out and showed the medics that the medical officer supporting the course would remove me from the course. That's a sensible thing to do. Yeah. And so I didn't tell them. I just sort of got on with it, and I figured one or two things would happen. Either I'd get so sick that I'd have to come off the course. I simply couldn't continue because I was too unwell, or I'd get to the end and sort it out there. Yeah, and so the latter happens, But the leg kept working, and I got to the end, and the day after the course finished, went to the doc at the base over in Perth, and who actually, there's a funny story in itself. He gave me a beasting. He said, "There's, you're a dickhead. What are you doing? This could have killed you, and you're only 2 days off losing your leg, and all this sort of stuff." And I subsequently ended up being his boss in effect when I was a doc over at the unit. It was quite a funny turn of events there. But it's what ended up happening was they tried to put a bunch of antibiotics through drips, and it sort of settled down but didn't completely. And there ended up being a collection of pus in the front of my knee, basically, that had to be surgically drained. And so even if I hadn't have been bumped off my Rio, that would have stopped me. I needed surgery for that. And then,
At some point.
Yeah, so that got drained, and they cut out a bit of tissue from the front of my knee that had turned to cheese, and spent a few days in hospital. I think it was about 8 days in hospital, and then had a thing called a PICC line put in. Have you ever had one?
Yeah, I haven't had one, but they were thinking of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can just keep pumping fluids. Yeah.
Yeah, I carried this little baby bottle full of antibiotics around with me, sort of 24 hours a day, pumping antibiotics into my system. And so that settled that down just in time to get medically cleared to deploy to Timor in the end. So deployed with 5RAR, and then my trip got cut short. I went to 2 Commando for a bit, and then ended up back at SASR. So it was a convoluted way of doing things.
But it got there in the end.
Yeah, it got there in the end.
And how was your selection course? How'd you find it?
It's probably one of the best things I've done in my life. Yeah, it's trying to talk about how it is doesn't do it justice, and particularly the last 5 days of it, the real crux of it, which they call Lucky Dip. The last 5-day period is just, there's not words to describe it. It's absolute sort of torture. But that said, in terms of an experience and opportunity to test yourself to the absolute limit and then beyond, I've not had anything like it before or after in my life.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess and then having had the chance to then be the doctor in support of a bunch of courses and look at them from that angle, it's an amazing thing, and there's a lot that goes into it, and it's all very deliberate and very. When I was a candidate on it, it sort of feels pretty loose, and it feels like it's not too regulated, and that things could go horribly wrong. But I now realise that that's not the case, and also I realise the amount of scrutiny that every candidate is under, and the amount of thought and energy that goes in from the unit's perspective to really looking hard and giving everyone a fantastic opportunity to show themselves either worthy or non-worthy of being considered suitable for further training for the unit. But in terms of it, I guess for me, it pushed my mental boundaries of where I thought I could push myself to. Yeah. It pushed that so far beyond where I'd previously thought it existed. And I'd done a lot of things like VO2 max testing, and in the sporting realm, I'd pushed myself pretty hard physically, but this just extended the parameters of my mental boundaries in terms of how far I could push myself exponentially, which has been a real positive experience moving forward. I think once you've redefined where that endpoint is, then you start to think, well, hang on, maybe this goal that I thought wasn't achievable actually is, if I just sort of push hard. Yeah,
because you start, and we're actually talking about this off air, about you start pushing that boundary, and you actually push that boundary further and further and further.
Yeah.
So, and you may have actually done harder things in selection, but without that, you had to keep pushing that boundary. So that boundary was actually moved a bit further for you to re-challenge.
And I think most of us go through our lives, and it's a very comfortable existence in the first world as a middle-class sort of a person, and you don't ever have a requirement to push yourself out of your comfort zone, and a lot of people don't. They just exist within that comfort zone, and I'm not judging that. That's fine, but it's rare to get the opportunity where you really have to test yourself. And like I said, to be given that opportunity in a very controlled and structured environment where if things had gone horribly wrong, there would have been a doctor on scene and an evacuation. Or, there's the safety nets in place. This isn't in the middle of nowhere, and if it goes wrong, you're dead type thing. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a brilliant opportunity to really push yourself.
I think that actually might help, because I know there are guys watching who want to go through selection. And I think that actually might help them of being like, well, actually, it may feel like you're in the middle of nowhere with nothing going on, but it is a structured course. It's all
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
it's
yeah.
made to make you feel like that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's actually it's done for a reason.
I think the other thing a lot of people, and geez, if anyone is listening to this and they're keen on selection,
I guarantee you, there are
reach
people
out.
I know watching. Yeah,
reach out, because a bunch of blokes did last year, and a few of them, I had the privilege of meeting up with them and sort of running a few of them through a bit of training here and there, and a few of them are now over at the unit and they've gotten through. And so I mean, it's something that I'm really passionate about, and I think certainly before the course I had a lot of misconceptions about the course, and I think the biggest one of them was that the unit was going to try and get you off the course. They were going to try and actively get you off the course, you know. But that's not the case. I mean, when you look at it from the unit perspective, they need people in the unit, but they need to be the right people. So there's a very high standard. It's very deliberate, and if you don't meet it, you're not going to get through. But they're not actively trying to get you off the course. You have to. I mean, and for the most part, people will remove themselves from the selection courses. It's quite rare for the actual unit to say, no, you're not suitable. It does happen, but the vast majority of people coming off the course have withdrawn own request. And so I think if you can change that mindset to, no, the unit actually does want me to be a part of it, I just need to be good enough to meet the standard, as opposed to they're going to be trying to kick me off at every chance they get, then that's a real mind shift change to the positive.
fucking oath, because I guess, you know, they need people, you know, but of
do.
course they need the right people, but
Yeah.
because they need the right, they're picking from this tiny drip fed where they've got a pool of people and they're getting a drip feed at the bottom. You know, they need people. But yeah, that going in with the mindset, I guess, that you're going to pass it is a big thing.
I think the other thing that people massively overestimate is the physical versus psychological component of the course, and this is another thing that I've observed. You talk to people who are training up for the course, and you know, before they do it, and they're very focused on the physical. They're pack marching a bunch. They're, you know, running their 3.2s. They're swimming. They're doing 1 million push-ups and all the rest of it. And then you talk to anyone who's done the course, or people involved in the de-essing on the course, supporting the course, they'll all tell you it's a mental game, which it is. And I mean, the two obviously linked. The more physically resilient you are, then the more psychologically you're going to be able to be resilient against the stressors of the course. But ultimately, the course is designed to physically break you down to a point where all you're left with is your psychological resilience, basically, that sort of underpinning innate resilience to what they're throwing at you. Everyone's injured, everyone's exhausted, everyone's depleted of their, you know, energy stores. You've all lost a lot of weight. So the physical thing is very important, but it's a mind game. And I look at with hindsight, I mean, I've completely failed to make any effort to improve my psychological resilience other than training, which builds a degree of psychological resilience, because you've got to have that mental aptitude to push yourself when you're tired. But I think there's a whole lot of potential psychological preparation that most people just don't even consider going into the course.
And what would that look like to you?
Oh, look, I think I've given this a lot of thought and played around with, I mean, retrospectively with stuff that I'm doing myself that I now get a lot of benefit from. But I mean, a ketotic diet, not that it's a purely psychological thing, but it's got some fairly significant psychological sort of benefits to it. But I think with hindsight, a ketotic diet, and it's interesting, there's been some stuff in the media in the last couple of months talking about US SOCOM, Naval Special Warfare, is looking at a ketotic diet for SEALs. And there was some suggestion that it decreases their oxygen requirement when they're diving. So if they're in ketosis, they could potentially dive longer on the same dive set. But there was some real interest from an Australian SOCOM perspective looking at ketosis. One bloke in particular that I used to work with who's still in, and I remember he was playing around with it. This is sort of 5, 6, 8 years ago, and I thought it was just black magic. He bought it to me, and I said, no, that's horseshit. It's a bad diet. And he's reminded me of that since a couple of times, and I'm completely happy to acknowledge that I was wrong there. But they were looking at it from a neuroprotective type perspective. So ketone bodies have been shown to be quite protective for your brain. the nerve fibers in your brain and the tissues, and they've shown this now in conditions like epilepsy, conditions like some of the forms of dementia, the progressive neurological diseases, that ketone bodies can reduce the seizures in epileptics and decrease the rate of decline in some of these cognitive diseases. But the military interest was from a perspective of traumatic blast injury, so subclinical traumatic blast injury, not the big bangs, the IED blasts and all that sort of stuff, but the smaller
percussion
blasts.
fired weapons and
Exactly. So breaching, firing, even 50 cals, shoulder fired anti-tank weapons, those sort of things. Just the stuff that doesn't sort of knock you around too much, but it's enough to put a shock through your brain. Has been shown to be causing these cumulative traumatic brain injuries, and there was this body of research looking at ketone bodies as being protective against that. Coming right back to your question. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, mate.
Well, I can cross it, because we were going to talk about the keto diet, because I know a lot of people are really interested in it, because I think people are almost a bit don't know how to look at it, because there's a lot of like articles to show that it's fantastic, and then there's just as many on the contrary of like, so you're gonna put a black coffee with 2 scoops of butter in it, and people don't know where to sit, and then you've come in and like, well, I'm a doctor, and people are like, what the fuck? Like,
I guess I haven't approached it from the perspective of being a doctor. I haven't gone and looked at all the scientific research and the evidence base and said, I've decided I'm going to give it a go because medicine says it's the right thing to do. So don't think that, please, anyone listening, don't think that that's the case. So, but I actually came to it in the last sort of year or so, because I had this chronic injury in one of the joints in my pelvis. Just this inflammation. I was doing a lot of weightlifting at the time, trying to get up to these target weights, and I had this niggle in my pelvis that just got worse and worse, and so I started to look at ways. I didn't want to chew anti-inflammatories the whole time, tablets, and I started looking at ways to reduce inflammation sort of without taking medications, and so that was what led me down the ice bath pathway. And it was what also led me down the ketotic diet pathway. And so that was the initial sort of drive to try both of those things. And then as I tried them both independently, I realized that when I was in ketosis, I just felt fantastic. Like my energy was through the roof. My sleep was exponentially better. I was spending bigger blocks in REM, that really deep sort of restorative sleep, which meant I needed less sleep overall. Woke up feeling great. You don't have those slumps after, like that sort of post-lunch, slump where you dump food in and then your body dumps insulin and then you feel flat because your blood sugar does its sort of dip. And so I just felt great, felt like $1 million, and so have continued with the ketotic thing on and off. Because I love that. And then the ice bath was initially for the injury, but then similar sort of thing. I started to realize that whilst the first few ice baths were absolute torture, hated them, that afterwards I just felt euphoric. I felt like $1 million as well, and that feeling would last, hours into the day. And so I started to get almost hooked on that after feeling of the ice bath, and the trauma of hopping in one became less and less, and now it's just something I do. It's part of my routine.
Well, that is on my list of things to talk about, was the ice baths. And guys, and these are the same gentlemen I know training for selection, looking to get into them, and they're starting off almost like the cold showers, because there's actually so much evidence to show that, like, if you have a shower, do the first 20 seconds cold, the middle part is your normal shower, and the last bit cold. And there's so much evidence apparently to show that it's fantastic for you. And they're starting there and moving to the ice baths. And they wanted to really know, it's one thing feeling a lot better, and that means something's right. But they want to know about if you've had any hormonal differences or anything with them.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not tracking my hormones.
Hormones or chemical sort of reaction to it.
Yeah, well, that's the theory. So there's a concept that's known as hormesis in scientific terms, and it's basically your body wants to sit within certain set parameters in a bunch of different areas. So, I mean, body temperature is one of them. You need to stay at or around 37 degrees Celsius. If you go too much further than that, up around the 40, 42, you get into the hypothermia space and that heat stroke type space. If you start to dip down 3 or 4 degrees Celsius and stay there down around the kind of 31, 32 mark, you push all your body systems out of that homeostatic range, and they start to fail, and you'll eventually die if you of hypothermia. So when it comes to temperature, and then there's a whole stack of others. Your body needs to be around a certain acidity. Your blood has to stay out. If it goes too high or low, your body systems start to fail, and the list goes on.
Yeah.
So the whole concept of hormesis is that you, with any of those things, if you push yourself out of the reference range, your body will frantically struggle to try and get back. And because for all it knows, you're not going to hop out of that ice bath and it's going to die. And so it starts dumping a bunch of chemicals into your system to activate a fight or flight response to empower you to be able to get out of the situation. And so like your body, once again, for all it knows, you've fallen into ice water and you need to swim and scramble out.
Yeah.
And so it starts to dump a bunch of hormones, a bunch of your stress response chemicals into your system, dopamine, serotonin, some of those feel-good chemicals in terms of neurotransmitters in your brain, but also cortisol, which is one of your stress response hormones, adrenaline, noradrenaline, those kind of fight or flight type things. And so that's what sort of ramps up your body, and the adrenaline, noradrenaline, that type of stuff's pretty short-lived. The cortisol gives you a slightly longer boost, and it sort of peps up your whole system. It peps up your immune system and a couple of other functions in your body, and leaves you feeling pretty vitalized in the short term. Now there is a flip side to this. If that system's chronically activated, then it can start to turn on you and can start to cause problems. But so the concept of hormesis is you float along, push your body out of its reference ranges for short periods of time, get those pulses of these hormones, and then put your body back in that reference range, and just sort of your body gets it's like a bit of a stress. It's like you go to the gym, you lift weights, it damages your muscles rebuild a little bit stronger, and then you can lift more weights next time. And so that's kind of this concept. You're stressing your immune system in small, controlled amounts.
It's quite an incredible thing. I know my limited experience with ice baths was in, it was Boxing Day. So late December 2017, I flew over to Finland, pretty much landed in Finland. And that same day, went to this girl's village. It's like minus 20. Like everything's frozen. And we ended up in the sauna, and it's like literally like 100-degree sauna. And then what they were doing, because it's dark, it was light for 2 hours a day, but not properly light, overcast. And what they were doing, like every day, the Finns, they go at the chainsaw, cut a hole in the ice, they go from the sauna to the ice, and they're meant to do it like 7 times or something, a ritual. And I was like, I'd just come off the back of a trip and like sub 2 and shit, and I'm out there like, oh fuck, I've got this, like watch this, Finns. Went from the sauna to and literally almost died. And I went in, and it was salt water. So apparently the water's actually sub-zero. Because salt won't freeze. Yeah. And they've cut through like a foot deep of ice. And I'm out there all staunching, this can't be that bad. I went in and no shit, came up like a seal, hooks for hands. I thought it was just you got to do it 6 more times. And I did it like 4 more times. I was like, that's done. But Garrett, that night, I felt so good after it. Yeah.
And that would have been that dump of all those chemicals.
Everything.
And there's endless ideas surrounding, what temperature, how long you should be in it for, whether you should alternate heat and cold. The list goes on. And then there's Wim Hof, the Iceman, who's sort of...
That's what guys were talking about today. Yeah.
So he's the real oracle on all of this, and anyone listening, if you're interested, have a listen to some of his audiobooks or get online and have a read of him. And so he's got a combination of breathing exercises and cold exposures, and he's got some programs and things. But I think it's worth having a wide look at all of this, and not, like we were talking about before, I don't think there's one set answer here. It's about taking it on board, understanding what the science is behind it, what it may offer, the upside, the downside, giving it a go, see how you feel, and see what works for you. And so it's I don't think you should just blindly follow one person because it's worked for them. But
because I know my very limited, but my experience with Finns was they used to really struggle with vitamin D because they can't get it because there's 2 hours of not even sunlight. So when I was staying with this family, we'd take the vitamin D and then go and jump in the ice. Because they said, it increases your circulation because you're going from hot to cold. Your body really pumps everything around, and that'll actually help that vitamin D absorb.
Okay.
And they have a big problem over there with people getting depressed. You know, for 6 months it's dark. Like it's basically dark for 6 months.
Yes.
And that, you know, that dump of that, all the chemicals, like those feel good chemicals. That's almost what they're needing.
Oh, for sure.
Because it can be depressing over there, man. Like I know we would go out and drink, and it was light when I was there, probably 12:30 and 2:30. And if we went out drinking all night, we'd come back, go to sleep, wake up, and it had already been day and dark.
You'd miss it.
And you're like, you've missed it. And we, bit of a bender, we'd have like 96 hours of dark. And if you worked normal hours, you would not be outside within light. And that's the reason they were doing it, was to sort of keep people sane almost.
Oh, that's a great idea. And certainly there's so many systems in your body that are regulating chemicals, regulating hormones, and light is a huge one for us. And our normal day-night sleep-wake cycles are generally regulated by light that stimulates a bit of a cortisol, so your stress hormone pulse in the morning. So that's sort of low overnight, so you can get your rest, and then it starts to grow towards kind of 6, 7, 8 in the morning, and then you wake up. So light stimulates you. You wake up, you get a pulse of cortisol, peps you up, makes you alert and awake, and then if you can get some sunlight into your system, particularly on your eyes, not looking directly at it, but on your eyes, that has an effect. The UV light goes into your pineal gland, a little gland behind your eyes in your brain, and then that little sucker makes serotonin, which is a feel-good chemical, and one of the chemicals that we can tinker with some of the antidepressant medications. Serotonin then gets converted into melatonin, which helps you sleep at night. And so, I mean, if you're not getting sunlight, it affects so many of those different systems, from the cortisol and your whole sort of stress response system in a good way, that regulates that diurnal variation, but also that serotonin, melatonin affecting your mood and your sleep. And so, everything goes out of whack.
Because they were worried about me, because I'd just known I'd come from, Adelaide, 45 degrees, hot every day, 13 hours or more, 16 hours of light. And they're like, you've come here to minus 20 to minus 40. And there's no light. Like, they're like, don't die. But have you ever been to Scandinavia?
No, I haven't. No.
You should put that on your bucket list. It changed my whole life.
Yeah, wow.
And I think it actually really, once I read the book Tribe, really actually reconfirmed a lot of his stuff, of my own experience with that. And him talking about communities and health and happiness and overall happiness, not like, oh, I have a nice car. That might make you sort of surface happy, but actually being in a community with people actually can really make you to the core happy.
Yes.
And the girl's parents are staying with, upper middle class, yet lived in like the buildings of like 5 families all share buildings because it's so cold. And she's north from proper cold. No one can afford to heat it themselves. So they all share the heat of the, it's just like a big row of houses all connected to share some heat. And literally every day they check on each other, because if something goes wrong there, and I remember the girl's dad talking to me like, look, this isn't like you'll be cold and it sucks cold. Like you and me go outside now, it suck. We'd survive. You will die. Like you will die. In minus 20, you'll die. And they'll check up on each other every day. And then the biggest one, I think, to his book was, I remember going, so the first morning I flew there, went to her house, walk in, greet her parents, very limited English. Oh, you got to come in the sauna with us. I'm like, righto. Like, okay. Next thing, I am with the girls my age. We're both 21 at the time. And I'm naked. We're both completely naked in a sauna with her parents completely naked. And I'm there as this Aussie, like, imagine if right now someone said, you got to get naked, Dan. You got to get with your family naked in a sauna together.
Wasn't I meant to take my clothes off, mate?
Maybe we should do this.
Shall I put my pants back on?
Yeah, this is how we're doing the new podcasting. It relaxes people. We're completely naked. And it was, they didn't think anything of it. I'm there like, what the fuck? Like, I'm lucky the sauna's warm. And we would go to community saunas where the whole suburb is naked together, from kids to elderly, naked together as one, because it's the only place fucking warm. And I think we've lost that a lot these days, to a degree. And now that goes into guys moving out of defence and struggling to really find that again.
Yeah.
But yeah, your Scandinavia, man, that opened my eyes to it a lot. Being like, holy shit, it seems on the surface like you're not as lucky as me. Like, he was a high level engineer.
Yeah.
And I'm like, shit, but you probably don't own the physical things that I do in Australia. But I can tell you, fucking happy. Like,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
things, I love it, mate.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. And it's, I guess, that sense of community. And when you talk about people discharging from defence, and certainly my experience with that and that loss of you, and you know, Junger.
Sitting over there, I think.
Yeah, it is right there.
Yeah.
Sebastian Junger. He talks about tribe, and it's a great term. I mean, you know, that's it is a tribal bond in the military that you have with your fellow soldier, and particularly if you've spent time deployed with them and you've really shared stressful experiences and the good and the bad. It is a real bond, and I hadn't fully appreciated the stress of transitioning out of that environment. For me, when I looked at leaving the army, I saw it as a positive, to be honest with you. Like, it was, I had a young family, and my wife, God bless her, had been raising the kids pretty much as a single mum because I was away so much of every year. And so we saw this as a family unit as the opportunity for me to be home, to be there, engaging in the kids as they were growing up, to be there to help sort of be the dad there to help with that sort of the day-to-day running of the household. And coupled to which we were paid well as army doctors, but the opportunity to earn significantly more as a civilian doctor was always there. And
Especially as a family, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, there was all these positives. But what I'd failed to realise, and I now look at with retrospect, having sort of looked really hard at what happened from a sort of social psychology perspective and a resilience perspective when I left the military, and I took a real dip. I lost, I didn't have an identity when I got out. I just didn't know who I was. I'd spent so long associating myself with my job, and that was kind of so intimately linked me and my job that when I wasn't doing that job anymore, I sort of didn't really know who I was, and I lost sort of a whole bunch of self-esteem that once again was tethered to that role, a thing called contingent self-esteem, which is good when things are going well and you're performing well in that particular role, but then all of a sudden when you're not that guy anymore, you don't have anything to base your self-worth on. And I look back and I think I'd gone through this period of 5 years with special operations where a lot was going on. There was a lot of cumulative trauma. I'd sort of had a whole stack of exposures of teammates getting hit and killed on the job, and lots of traumatic episodes. But I'd managed to, with hindsight, go really quite well through all of them. None of it caught up with me. I was able to function and continue to deploy and on and on. And it wasn't until I left defence that I really started to have some of this stuff come back and sort of surface. And with hindsight, I realise now that when I have looked back and looked further into the construct of resilience, and you talk about community, I mean, community, that social acceptance and that being part of a community group and having that team environment is really bolsters your resilience, and that sort of helps your overall self-worth, that feeling of acceptance. And the physical sort of component of it was there too. We were training hard because you had to stay fit, and so the physical stuff, I was physically well. I felt that I was contributing to the unit. I felt what we were doing overseas was meaningful. I believed in my role within that organisation, was making a contribution. And so there was all of these things that were making me, and I was getting trained to a high level in certain skill sets that I needed, the military stuff and the medical stuff. And so I was moving forward there, and that was bolstering my self-esteem. And so I had this huge amount of resilience within that construct as an individual. And then that group in itself was super resilient, because it's a whole bunch of people that really want to be there. They're really focused. They've worked hard to be at that unit, and they're inherently people that are resilient by nature innately, and then they get all this additional resilience built in through the training and the organisation. And so with hindsight, I realised I was able to sort of resist all that cumulative stress of the job, because I had all this resilience, I had all this support internally and externally. And then it was when that support got dropped away because I discharged, and all of a sudden I sort of didn't know who I was. I didn't have my mates around me. I wasn't doing anything that I felt was useful. And all that cumulative chronic stress that I'd kind of built up just started to surface. I'd sort of lost that resilience against it, if you like.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's interesting to look back and see what had happened there, and then the pathway back to getting good again.
And what did that pathway look like? Was that being involved in the TACMed training?
Yeah, well, TACMed helped a lot. So it was basically just rebuilding myself as a civilian doctor, and also trying to find something that I felt was meaningful and that gave me self-worth and that I felt was contributing to others outside of the military was what I needed to do. And that took years, and it was made up of a lot of little things. I mean, the opportunity to get in on TACMed was a huge part of it, because that kept me, not only was that very interesting in from a business perspective. When I got out, I'd enrolled in an MBA, so I did that. That was one good thing that I had lined up to go straight into when I got out of the army, because I recognised I was going to be lacking stimulation, basically. And so I had that to go to. TACMed allowed me to start to use some of those theoretical skills in a bit of a practical application, which was good. But more so than that, it was blokes like Jeremy and Adam, the other two blokes that co-own TACMed. Jeremy Holder, who was the founder of the company and owned it himself for the longest time before we bought in, to be back engaged with those like-minded people. You know, it was, and coming back to that tribe concept, this was an ability to re-engage with people who saw the world like I did, who had shared experiences. I'd been over in Afghanistan with Adam on one occasion. I never deployed with Jez. Our careers just overlapped slightly, but we knew the same people. We'd done the same jobs. We'd been to the same places. And so it was an ability to be able to kind of anchor into that environment and be around like-minded people. We were training a lot of police tactical groups, some military people, some government guys who are all pretty like-minded. So it allowed me to, because I'd popped out into a civilian job, and I'd spent 15 years being in the military and looking at civilians as the out group. You know, we're military, they're civvies.
It's fucking easy to do.
Yeah, it is. And we all do it. I mean, there's social identity theory is what sort of looks at how we group ourselves in society, and it talks about in-groups and out-groups. And so, I mean, you know, military civilians is a good example. You get in the military, and then the civilians are the out-group, you're the in-group, and you're like, oh, civvies, they wouldn't get it. There's no discipline. They turn up 10 minutes late and blah, 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 don't iron their shirts and all that sort of shit. Then in the army, you go to a certain corps, and then you say, oh, right, I'm infantry, they're armoured or whatever, they're shit, we're good, you know. And it's how you build esprit de corps, but it's at risk of putting the out group down, you know, to build your own in group, and then you get refined from there. And I suppose I'd gone through that pathway where I'd gone into the army, so all of a sudden it's army, and then there's civvies over there, and then I'd gone into whilst I was medical corps, I'd gone into the infantry stream, and then special operations. And so all the while I was distancing myself from the civvies and feeling like I was somehow significantly different to them, and dare I say, it's embarrassing to say, but superior to them. You know,
it's easy to do though. I remember vividly at Singleton, my platoon, we weren't allowed to walk on the footpaths.
Right.
I remember my platoon sergeant and old Royal Marine Commando going, "Oi, lads, get off. You ought to walk on the fucking road. That footpath is for civilians to stand and clap you as you fucking walk past." And we, the whole time, went to walk on the fucking roads. There's cars beeping us, and we're there, like, marching along, like, in slouch hats. Like, oh, fuck. Yeah, that was the whole thing, was you are superior. They had to clap you. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's easy to fall into that trap, and it's good to build that esprit de corps and to really build that group cohesiveness. But the issue is, I guess, it can be toxic when you're being derogatory to that out group. But the real problem came when it was time to leave the army. And guess what? One day I'm army, the next day I am a civilian. And so I've spent, 14, 15 years looking down my nose at this group of people who are inferior to me in my small mind. But then all of a sudden I'm one of them, and I didn't want to be one of them. I didn't know how to be one of them. And it was just sort of a real fish out of water when I first popped out. But slowly I engaged with the TACMEN crew. I got into my uni, which was great. Went through some ups and downs for a few years there, but the real turning point for me was I was doing some fly in, fly out job at a mine site.
Yeah, you did mention it, and that was on my to talk about that. Yeah. You're like, well, I left the military to spend more time with my family.
Yep.
Yet I've left the military. I'm spending more time away working rurally as a doctor.
Yeah, so I was away from home. I was still missing key events and not there to help with the family, and coupled to which I didn't feel that I was really value adding. You know, I wasn't doing, in my opinion, a really meaningful medical job. It was a necessary job. It was doing all the medicals for the miners, and it was important. But I didn't feel that I was contributing like I wanted to, and so I ended up. I was applying for a different job, and I ended up hitting an old mate of mine he'd been a reserve doctor with the SAS, and he was a bloke I'd spent some time in Afghanistan with and come to know quite well. And he was, so I'd hit him up for a reference for another job. He said, hey, if you're looking for a job, he was running a small hospital up in central Queensland, a little regional hospital. He was the boss up there, the medical superintendent, and his second in command, the deputy med super, had to leave on because of family issues. He said, look, if you're looking for a job, why don't you come up and be my second in command? And I sort of thought about it for a second, spoke to my wife, and we decided we'd go and have a look, and we did, and it looked great. And so we, mid-school year, pulled the kids out of school, moved up to Queensland and started this job. And it was a steep learning curve. So it was helping run this little regional hospital, working in the emergency department and then working on the ward as well. So it's sort of the roster alternated. And it was you were working at least 13-hour days, so big days.
Big days, fucking hell.
6 on, 4 off. But for me at that time, it was exactly what I needed. So it meant that I got right back into it. I was on this steep learning curve. There was a stack of skills from medicine that I hadn't used in my army career, you know, because in the army you see healthy young blokes for the most part, and you occasionally see them when they're injured or whatever else. But if they get sick, or if they were sick in the first place, they didn't get in. You know, and then if they got sick enough, they got discharged from the military. You didn't see any kids, you didn't see any old people. I hardly saw any females, and so here I was back in ED seeing the full spectrum, and so I had to pick up all these skills, and so that was great. And I slowly but surely started to just feel like I was contributing again. You know, I was treating people in ED once in a while. In ED, you save someone who's having a big heart attack, or, you know, you make a difference, which I didn't feel I was doing at the mine site. And I'd finished up my MBA, and so I was starting to use some of those skills in the medical management realm. And this mate of mine, fantastic bloke, was mentoring me in that space. And so I was hanging out with him. He was a good guy and working hard, didn't give me a lot of time to sit around and think about things, which was good for me at that point. So, and it just kind of really recalibrated me, and it was during that phase that I kind of moved past that period where I'd found myself, you know, dwelling on some of the trauma, and I really started to process it and realize and actually moved past the point of coming back to like baseline and feeling good, to the point of this, what we now know in the literature as post-traumatic growth, to this point where I'm like, holy shit, life is fantastic. And I am so fucking lucky to have gone through everything I've gone through. I've got both my legs, both my arms, and I've got this amazing opportunity as a civilian now. I've got a family. I've got this job that allows me to enjoy a good lifestyle. And so, you know, I've got to make the most of this. And there's a bunch of people we left overseas. Well, we brought them home, but I mean, they were killed on operations, and so they didn't have the opportunity to continue to live this life I do. So I got to live it properly for them.
Yeah, fucking oath. And it's pretty heavy, and you know you sort of carry that weight with you.
Yeah.
And you touch on post-traumatic growth. Now I claim around my circles that you keyed that to. We're giving it to you.
No, I can't claim that, mate. No,
it doesn't matter. You're not claiming it. I am. I'm claiming it for you.
All right, thank you.
I've said on multiple podcasts, but Dan Pronk always says this: but it's fucking true. And I think
Yeah.
you're an envisionment of that. And I think post-traumatic growth is a fantastic thing to be able to take your experiences from that and then really make something of it.
Yep.
And honestly, Sue, a lot of your stuff, that's, what I've been trying to do as well.
Yeah.
Is to grow from what's gone wrong. Because I know we talked earlier about, victim status, and you could have easily done that too. I was this SAS operator doctor, and now I'm this. Easy to fall into that victimhood of it.
Yep.
And not grow from what's traumatic.
Yeah.
And I constantly say it. I had said with, I won't say his name, but we'd know him. And I met him overseas at a special operations conference, and I mentioned to him, well, cancer's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Other than the dying thing, it's the best thing ever. But that trauma of that, I wouldn't be the person I am now, 18 months on, if not for that. And you would not be the man you are without, if you didn't take those steps and what things happen overseas, you'd be a clinical doctor.
Yeah. You're spot on, and it's a weird thing to say out loud that to be able to acknowledge that some of the worst days of your life have actually been the best thing that could have happened to you. But I'm in the same boat. I mean, some of the stuff that happened in Afghanistan, and what I'm referring to are instances where I responded to injured teammates and couldn't save them. And so I had a couple of instances where blokes that I was trying to save died while I was trying to save them, and just simply couldn't beat the injuries on the day. And those things, as horrible as they are, they open your eyes to how good life is. And so, I mean, we all float through this life, and I mean, I bang on about it in the book, talking about that suck meter. And that's going to sound a bit abstract to anyone who hasn't sort of seen the book, but it's basically just the concept that we float along calibrated to our day-to-day life in first world middle class society, where life's great, but we can't see it because it's our norm. And so, it takes something exceptional for us to have a good day, or something, a little bit bad for us to have a bad day. Yeah. But then you go and have these experiences where it redefines your idea of what a bad day looks like. And so, for me, that is kneeling in the dirt over a bloke that I had breakfast with that morning who's been critically injured, and not being able to save that guy's life. And that, all of a sudden, this idea of having a bad day back here in Australia, where you bend your car, and which is another instance that, I'll talk about that in my book. I sort of fucking up the paint job on my car type thing, and which ate me up at the time I did it. But then I'd gone and had these other experiences that really put perspective on that, and sort of makes you realize, gee, that's trivia. It's trivia, which most of the things that we get hung up about in a first world society is trivia, but it's hard to see that unless you've had the other perspective. Yeah,
and I know I've had a negative reaction with some of that stuff too, of people should understand, that, but they don't have to sympathise with you either. As far as, and I'll use my example of, just because my worst day is getting told you've got this tumour, doesn't mean that your bad day doesn't matter anymore.
Yes.
And I know I went through a real thing of, it's fucking toxic months, man, of like this, well, shut the fuck up. Like, you think you've got a problem, like, well, look at my fucking problems. Yeah. And comparing myself to them, and fuck you, look at me. And it's fucking toxic. And I know I was doing it. And I know fucking problems. And comparing myself to them, and fuck you, look at me. And it's fucking toxic. And I know I was doing it. And I know, use an example of, a teammate dying overseas who you worked on. No one's ever saying that's not traumatic as hell for you, but that also doesn't mean people come back and be like, well, fuck your society. And I know I've struggled with it massively, man, especially with, different experiences I've had of like, well, how can you march down this street and say this, and I've seen this, and I've done this, and this happened to me? Well, no, like, that's my personal experiences, and this matters to them. And I've had to take on this new stance, and I know I was lost in the mix when I was doing it, but well, just because of what's happening to me or someone else doesn't mean your problems don't still matter.
Yep.
The way some things affect some people
Yep.
is as significant as others. We all react to things differently. But I went through a fucking toxic phase, man, of like, oh, fuck, I broke up with my missus, I feel bad. And my response wouldn't be, fuck, man, you're right. It'd be, well, at least you don't have fucking cancer. I still throw that out occasionally, but just taking the piss with the boys. But I honestly believed it, man. I honestly believed, fuck you, stop complaining. And that was toxic. I know I've ruined friendships over it. And it's a hard thing for us to come back to.
I hear what you're saying, and it's, I mean, that is the ultimate trump card, though. The old boom.
You should see me go.
I see your parking fine, and I raise you brain cancer.
That's me. That's me every time I want to go to the pub with the boys. So I was telling you yesterday when we won the beers. I went. The boys like, oh look, I don't want to drink on a Thursday, And I went. I was like, hey boys, I don't know how many more Thursdays I've got left.
You're a son of a bitch.
It works well.
Awesome though. Yeah, well played. But no, I hear what you're saying there, and I experienced a similar thing. That when I realised it was like this weight lifted off me, and it was almost, and it's sort of I'm somewhat ashamed to say it, but I mean I almost felt like I had this entitlement, like I was owed something when I got out of the army, and I don't exactly know what that something was, whether it was respect or status, or they're probably the same thing, but I mean I just felt, and I also I went through stages where I didn't want to tell anyone anything, and I just sort of thought I'd bottle it up and write it out. And then there was other stages where I thought maybe it'd be useful to reach out and tell people some of my experiences. But then my attempts to do that, they weren't being met with the response that I thought was appropriate for the story I was telling. And that sort of pissed me off. I'm thinking, how dare you not respond with more emotion to this story that you can see is sort of, and I went along like this for a while, and like you say, getting a bit sort of pissed off as if I was owed something or somehow I was special. And I had this somewhat with my wife as well. Like I was trying to let her in on some of the stuff that had gone on so that she could appreciate why it was taking a little while to kind of get used to being out of the army or used to being home. And she couldn't get it, and I could see that, and that would piss me off because I sort of interpreted that as her not really sort of taking it seriously. And then I just realised on one occasion that I wasn't owed a fucking thing for a start. I had this realisation, no, hang on a second. How dare you be so arrogant to think that society owes you anything? That the people that I'd tried to, tell stuff to who didn't show the response that I thought they should, simply couldn't show that response because they haven't experienced it. Just like I haven't experienced their trauma. Everyone's had trauma. And exactly as you say, it's not a competition. It's not about whose trauma's the best, they win, and they should be the one that gets the pity. It's all relative to your lived experience. And so, I mean, if you live I use the term often, but I mean a first world middle class existence, and then your trauma is calibrated by that. So witnessing a car crash where someone's bleeding terribly or has had a sort of significant injury, or I see a dead body on the side of the road, that's hugely traumatic for that person. And that proportionate to their life experience and to the resilience they have built against trauma, that's a devastating experience. And so that will have the impact on them that would be equivalent to, say my situation where I'd had a lot of training, had built a lot of sort of skill sets to be able to deal with a higher level of trauma, and dead body on the side of the road for me would be no worries. But this other stuff, that's traumatic for me, and everyone's different, and so it's this realization that I had at some point there a few years after I got out of the military that I wasn't owed anything, and one of the things that I sort of ruminated on that made me come to this realization was thinking of a bloke who had come to one of the military units I was with, who had been a professional footballer before he came into the army. And so he'd come in, really good guy, and he ended up doing selection, going over to SASR. He's still there. I actually saw him, bumped into him in Tasmania a couple of months ago. He was down there on a course, and I was there doing... Anyway, he came into the army. So he'd been this pro football player in New South Wales. He was a rugby league player. And so he turns up, and he was a big deal in the footy world. Some people knew who he was, some people didn't know who he was. But the story being, he turns up in this unit, and he's got a little bit of novelty, and people appreciated that. However, he needed to prove himself as a soldier, which he did. And he took that on. He took that on really well. He didn't come in with any ego. He came in and accepted that he was a private soldier day one at this infantry unit, and that's where he started. And then he built himself from there and became outstanding recon soldier in infantry selection SASR. And this sort of, when I came to think about it, it's no different to me. I'd done this. I'd had this opportunity to operate at a high level in the army, and then I pop out and I'm a civilian doctor. The fact that I did that over in the army should have no bearing on that. I need to now establish myself and prove myself again in that world. It doesn't entitle me to all of a sudden jump up 10 rungs of the ladder. I've got to hop on the bottom rung and work my way up because I'm in a new environment now. And which was that opportunity I had in Queensland to start building that skill set up and reestablish myself. But just that sort of realization that I'm not owed anything, that people who I am trying to tell stuff can't appreciate it, and it's not their fault. It's not that they don't want to, or they're trying to trivialize or diminish my experiences. They just can't possibly get it for the simple fact that they didn't live it, just like I haven't lived any of their trauma. I couldn't understand theirs. And like you say, their trauma is real to them. Yeah. Just like my trauma is real to me. And it's not a contest. And as soon as I realized that, it was like, wow, I get it now. I can move forward. But it took a while.
It does, man. That sort of thinking you're owed something off the universe doesn't know you fucking shit. And I know probably one of the most toxic things I had, and this was at least 6 months. I couldn't watch any news on TV because fucking anything, to be honest, because I'd watch the news and Channel 10 or Channel 9 or whatever, and such has been arrested for being a pedophile or a murderer. And I'm like, they're 60 years old. I'll be lucky to be 25, 30. You fucking piece of shit. How come I get this life sentence and you'll go to jail for 10 years for living a life of crime? And I had to come to the realization of, but what they've done has no bearing on me, and what I've done has no bearing on them. And you're not deserved of anything. I'm not owed anything. And Christopher Hitchens, who I'm a big reader of and a big fan of, it's fucking photos on my wall. But his final book, and his last. So he writes, and it's actually funny when you read it. And I'll sort of spoil it a bit here for you, but it pretty much just ends at a chapter, and you're like, that chapter didn't feel ended. And then the next chapter is written by his wife, and the last one's by his student. He died of throat and lung cancer. Anyway, his whole book, his whole stand is on how you're not, through his cancer diagnosis, I'm not owed anything. And people with cancer tend to do a lot of the why me. And he asked the question back in a couple of chapters, why not me? What have I done to deserve to not have this that everyone else has? And he was like, why not me? He's like, I'm in a chemo clinic as a 65-year-old man next to a 6-month-old kid with cancer. Well, it's easy to say, why me? It's more easy for him to say, why me? Why not me? And it's true. And it's one of those, I think not being owed something is a pretty grim realization, but you'd be fucking happier once you've realized it. Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, because you can carry that around, or you can let it go. I mean, and ultimately, the choice is yours for any of this stuff. It doesn't seem like it is a lot of the time, but it is. And it's a choice to take action against something or not, and it's a choice to do basically anything you want. At some point, you make the decision. And putting yourself out there, one of my big things, you never regret things you really try, you really put effort into. And you talk about this in your book a lot of you're better off trying something and not succeeding at it. And you may be trying something and then change the path, and that's fine, but never doing it isn't right. And you break down, and I can't remember the acronym you used for planning. Oh, so that's SMART goals. SMART goals. It is SMART? And the setting goals and achieving them. But almost the funniest thing that I read into that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's not about, so your SMART goal might be to be an SAS trooper. That whole SMART planning doesn't have a step of, okay, then you're this trooper. It's preparing yourself to give yourself the best opportunity to become that.
Yeah.
And if you properly plan that correctly and you still don't make it, then I've done everything within my power to do it, and it hasn't, something along the line hasn't gone right.
Yeah.
Or if you're doing it and think, well, actually, I want to be here, then that's all right to do as well.
Yeah. Oh, no, you're exactly right. I mean, that whole SMART goal thing is just about, and that's certainly not my thoughts. I couldn't tell you who came up with that, but I mean, it's something that I've sort of reiterated. But it's just about defining that goal rather than having this loose pie in the sky dream to be an astronaut or whatever else. It's about breaking that down and making it, specific, measurable. And the list goes on in terms of the acronym. However, it's just defining that goal. But the point that I kind of convey there is you need to set those goals and move towards them. But whether you actually get to that end point, ideally you do, because that's what you started on the trajectory for. But it may be that you don't quite end up there, or you end up going down a different pathway, or things don't play out as you plan, or you give it your best shot and you just couldn't get there. But I suppose my overwhelming ethos is to not die wondering, to be honest with you. And that was from a triathlon perspective, whilst I did not achieve anywhere near the level that I had aspired to there, I can look back now as a 42-year-old, now that window's closed. I mean, there's no way I could go back now and try and become a professional athlete. That's just the reality of it. But I can look back and say honestly that at that time in my life, I gave it my best and it didn't eventuate. And I'm not looking back thinking, geez, I wonder if I could have. And same with the whole SAS piece. So I look back now and think, yeah, that was fantastic. I gave it a go. I got on the course, got through, did that, spent some time there. Didn't achieve all my objectives within special operations. However, achieved most of them. And so, but I'm not looking back thinking, geez, I wonder if I could have done selection, you know? And so but by that same token, and I do mention it as well in the book, there's stuff that I've started that I gave a decent shot to, and then I could see as I went along, it just was not the right thing for me. And so I think this idea of failure and quitting that have got such negative connotations in sort of modern society, quitting particularly, I think quitting's clever in terms of if you've given something a really good go and you're obviously not going to achieve the level you wanted, or you're not headed in the direction that you wanted, and that's clear, then, quitting's clever, and putting that energy into something different that you can achieve is useful. Or if it becomes clear as you go along that it just isn't where you want to go. And I'd started a Master of Policing, Intelligence and Counterterrorism at one point. And I got a year into that. And as I went through that year, I did the subjects, and I really wasn't particularly enjoying it. I was doing okay and it was all right, but I wasn't loving it. I wasn't engaged. And in that year, I was starting to look at what direction that might head in terms of occupation. I was starting to sort of talk to a few people in the intelligence communities and see what they're doing and what they're up to and what was going on, which was where I thought I might want to go when I got out of the army. And it occurred to me, hey, this isn't what I want to do. This is not aligned with where I want to go in life. And so I cut that course, and in effect I threw away however many grand in tuition fees and burnt a year of my life. And I've never used those skills that I learnt again, or any of that sort of knowledge. But it wasn't where I wanted to go. I could see that clearly, and after a year, so I cut it and then started to look towards the MBA, which has been a fantastic qualification for me, and it's opened a lot of doors, and it's given me a skill set that's been really useful to me. So it allowed me to free up the bandwidth to go and do that. Whereas if I had just blindly plugged on with it for 2 more years because I didn't want to quit it, I would have wasted that time where I could have been allocating that energy elsewhere.
Yeah, and you speak of the MBA being a fantastic thing you've really used. Like, it really flex that muscle. In pretty much the opener of your book, you talk about now I own a Ferrari and a Lamborghini and this, and I just remember reading it settle down, mate.
It sounds grandiose.
It has a bit of a staunch on me in the beginning, but But at the same time, then you sort of go into, well, actually, it doesn't just rock up. You know, yeah, fuck, I worked hard for this.
Yeah, yeah. Oh no, for sure. And I guess anything in life, I think, for the most part, is achievable. However, I think it's generally these ambitious goals are simple but not easy, I think is a good way of putting it. I mean, they're simple in the fact that if you map them out and then just work your ass off, and you are willing to work harder than the bloke next to you for months, years, you can get to those goals. I really believe that in most things in life, that they are achievable for most people if you're willing to work for it. And like I said, it's a simple equation. It's just set goal and break it down into little chunks, chip away at them, and make the sacrifice, and you can get there. But it's not easy, and that's why most people don't do it.
Yeah, it's fucking
it's easier not to.
And it's very similar to, and you mentioned him in your book too, Gary V. His name, I can't remember his bloody last name. Vaynerchuk. That's it. Fucking good Instagram too.
Yeah.
And it's actually funny. He talks about the sort of new generation of entrepreneurs are not grinding like he's like they're fake. Yeah. He's like, they want that end goal, so they're on Instagram with a photo of a G-Wagon and a Louis Vuitton bag and a this and that. But he's like, they've never done the grind. He's like, it's all fucking fake. It's you know, just fabricated. Yeah. They haven't been that behind the scenes grind, and it's easy. I forgot who it was. I think it was a boxer who won a fight, and I was like, oh, is he the easiest $10 million in 17 seconds? And he's like, well, actually, if you break, and you mentioned very similar to this in your book, if you break down the 30 years of training before that, it's probably getting paid $8 an hour. In the gym, for no guarantee of anything.
That's exactly right. And I think that's the real trap of social media. You know, your Instagrams where you've got 1 minute to put something up, and this opportunity to filter your life to just put 1 minute snapshots of what you want other people to see. And it's false. And I guess the unsuspecting young person looking at that gets this false impression of who these people are and how they live. And I think what it doesn't allow is, of course, you're putting up that 1 minute, and like you say, the 17-second fight that they earn $10 million for, but you're not putting up that 10,000 hours of deliberate practice that led to mastery of the skill. And exactly as you said, you hit the nail on the head, with no guarantee of any return for that. So, I mean, that is being invested day in, day out, hour in, hour out by these professionals. And that's in all realms. And, you know, it's the same in the sporting realm. And I talk in the book about the special operations realm is this sort of murky world where you get snippets on social media or the news when something significant occurs and one of the SOCOM elements pops up. But what you don't see is the grind, and that sort of decades of hard work that goes into becoming the soldier that then busts their ass and gets to one of these units and then grinds for years to be proficient and maintain those skills, and then goes on operations and something goes well and it pops up on the news. Yeah,
it's very easy to watch those 3-minute videos on the SAS, jump out of the choppers and shit, and not to see what goes into the behind the scenes. And I'm not saying I understand that, but fucking hell,
I think you do. I mean, it's the same across the board. It's just that sort of that grind, and it's not, you see the shiny shit, you don't see the days and days of being cold and wet and thirsty and hungry and busting for a piss and airsick and seasick and all that sort of shit that goes into it, sitting on an airstrip waiting for a trigger to do whatever for days at a time. And so you just see the shiny shit, and you get kind of
we had an argument about this at work the other day with we were like, because there was an F-18 flying around the base. We go, and the boys like, oh, it's the second best job. SAS is the first. And I'm like, nah, straight up, I reckon I'd put fighter pilots first, because one, they don't do any of the really bad shit. Like, the SAS looks real cool, but on the surface too, they hold the longest patrol in Afghan and all this other stuff that would suck. That dude is just sleeping, eating good food, and flying a $50 million plane. Like, he's killing it. Like, I'm not saying he hasn't done the grind. But he doesn't do that much, and anymore sucks. Like,
you know what?
I'd jump in that.
I remember I was talking to an Apache pilot overseas on one occasion, and he'd been in support of one of our operations, and And I was saying to him, man, that must be so fucking cool. You know, you're cruising around in this thing. 'Cause Apaches are cool things.
cool as fuck.
They're cool to look at. They're cool when they're overhead. Everyone loves them, and they do their thing, and they drop missiles.
Not as cool as a tiger, but
yeah, when they fly. And I was talking to this bloke, and I said, man, you have got the best job. And he says, you know what? When we're up there, we are looking down on you guys, thinking what I wouldn't give to be down on the ground.
That's
and
true.
being one of those things. So it's one of those grass is always greener type things.
Oh yeah,
but-
fucking hell. I remember I was say 10 k's into a pezza one day, a field pezza was always brilliant, and F-18 again came over in like a tail slide, and I'm like, well, fuck, I picked the wrong job, eh? Because that's originally what I wanted to do. I went through school to fly planes. I got scared away by the Rosso.
Yeah, sure.
Just you hit all there, but yeah, fucking awesome. Good shit.
There's a surprising amount of, and I don't know if you've caught the podcast on the Unforgiving 60 on Ben's podcast of that F-18 pilot that had gone across and been a SAS troop commander, Robbo. And there's a surprising amount of F-18 drivers that end up over at SASR.
But it's elite either way.
Yes.
And I think I actually similarly spoke. I had dinner with Mark Donaldson a while back, and we spoke about the elitist of, you see so many successful businessmen like yourself who have come out of the SAS. Now they were going to be elite. The mindset of people who get in positions like that, be it fighter jets, SAS, and there's other jobs like that, they are going to be successful whatever they put their mind to. So there are plenty of entrepreneurs, say Elon Musk. No matter what you think of him, if he grow up with the passion to be in fucking the special operations, he's the type of guy that would have done it, because he would have found any other fucking way to get there. And it seems like, I'm not surprised that there are F-18 pilots that in the SAS, and you'd probably find if fucking Danny Ricciardo grew up wanting to be in the SAS, he probably would have been as well. It's that top 1%, like that bell curve of the bell curve we were talking about, that you're just that sort of dude.
I agree completely, and I think I guess it's just the way certain people are wired, and the aptitude and the
commitment too.
Yeah, I guess there's that. And I suppose there's nature and nurture that play into all of that, and circumstance. And like you say, I think there's a particular sort of person that's geared towards that. And exactly as you say, whether they happen to drift into motorsport and start driving a kart when they're 6 years old and end up as Ricardo or Schumacher, or whether they end up, running around with a bloody toy M16 and end up fucking commanding officer of the SAS regiment, like my brother did, or they're driving a fast jet. I think you're quite right. It's a similar personality type, and something that struck me as I went through my study and did entrepreneurship as a university subject, which was just fantastic and really kind of gave me the appetite to launch some entrepreneurial ventures, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, is that personality profile that we associate with entrepreneurship is almost exactly the same as the personality profile of a special operations soldier, and that's that's comfortable with risk, works well in small teams with no guarantee of success, and all of this sort of stuff, willing to hang it out there and work hard with limited reward, and it's with a really ambitious but unlikely endpoint. And there was you could sort of put that personality profile against both those occupations, and it fits both. And like you say, there's no shortage of ex special operations or military across the board in that for that manner that pop out of the military and are quite successful in the business world, and it's unsurprising when you look at it.
Yeah, fucking hell. We just need to get rid of 3 hour in the business world. Go to fucking any defence industries event. Like, what'd you do? I was 3. Like, of course you fucking were. Fuck off. Mr. Hickey and everyone else. You're like, get out of here. It's everywhere. First guy to tell you, parrot too.
Old faithful, hey?
Oh, fuck. I always take the piss out of Blair. I'll say to him, she's like, hey, man, what's the difference between, yourself and a bowler? What? You're both not airborne. Just like you're a prick.
That is cold.
Yeah, always ucks that. Always got to chuck out some bants to him.
Oh dear.
That's always how it goes. Now, we will touch on a little bit, and we've sort of skipped around a bit of your deployments overseas.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I guess this is basically what, like the way before knowing you personally, I basically knew you as, an operator doctor. That people are like, Jesus, that's a fucking quite a thing.
Yeah.
And your time overseas. And basically I want to touch on like what your expectations were versus the reality of what those tours were.
Yeah. I mean, as we discussed earlier, I had this idea that I wanted to be a doctor with special operations from end of 2001, and then come 2009, I finally got that opportunity. So I'd gone and done the selection course. I'd bounced back to 5RA. I'd done the deployment to Timor. That got cut short. Went to 2nd Commando Regiment and had the opportunity to deploy with the Special Operations Task Group pretty soon after that. So it was sort of this realization of my dream to be a doctor with special operations. And then shortly after that, it's like, guess what? You get to go overseas and be the doc. And because I'd done that selection course, it gave me this. I was in this fortunate position where I had this credibility I wouldn't have otherwise had, and I think I was a bit of a novelty act, dare I say. Like, it was sort of just like, oh wow, this guy's interested in military stuff, not just being the doc. And so the company commander of the commando element that I was attached to, that ended up deploying with the SOTG, he was a great guy, and he was very interested in getting me involved and getting me out on the ground. He sort of identified that I had that interest, and then in the pre-deployment training gave me a lot of opportunities to prove that I was not going to be a liability out on the ground.
Yeah.
And so, which is, it's a concern with any of us. And I suppose none of us know how we're going to go until it happens. But anyway, he gave me a lot of opportunities to get out and about. And so my first trip to Afghanistan, that's exactly what happened. There was this expectation that I would go out with every mission, which I absolutely loved. It was fantastic. In those days, that was 2009, we were still doing a lot of vehicle-mounted stuff. That the IED threat was there, but it wasn't as extreme as it became later. And so I was out and about constantly. That said, it wasn't as kinetic as future tours for me, in that we were operating mostly out of vehicles, which kept us mostly in Uruzgan province, fairly local, which was relatively calm at that point. So we'd get in semi-regular gunfights, but it certainly was nothing compared to my future tours when we were doing a lot of air mobile stuff down into Helmand province, where it was far more kinetic. But it was, in terms of my expectations, that first trip was just brilliant. I felt that I'd arrived. That was
really,
I was doing the job. I was on the ground. I was treating some casualties. But by that same token, we had a lot of near misses and a lot of good luck. There was people getting, the pistols shot off their kit and holes through their uniforms not hitting them, radios blown off, and one bloke had a weapon shouldered and a bullet lodged in his magazine well, and all these sort of time and time again we were having these near misses. A couple of blokes got shot, but not serious, and so I suppose it created a bit of a false sense of security. So we finished that rotation. We'd gone down into Helmand province and had a couple of decent days fighting down there, and hadn't sustained any casualties, and so everything went well. It was a good rotation. We had no one killed, which was, with hindsight,
that's the definition of a good
yeah.
trip.
So everyone who we left with came home with us, and so I suppose after that one, that was my benchmark for what a rotation looked like, and I didn't know any different. And compared to my Timor trip, it was just off the charts. It was fantastic. And so I'd come back and then finished up my time at 2nd Commando, had finally gotten back across to SASR, and then pretty soon after I got back there, deployed again with them on my second tour. And it was in that trip that we started doing a whole bunch more fighting. And that was when we started to lose guys as a task group and have a whole stack more casualties. And that was, I suppose, the realization of the job. And that was when, if you like, the veneer came off it, and I sort of saw what it was for what it was.
Yeah, that was going to be the next question. Did it all sort of come down to earth when, fuck, we were flying in the clouds, and now we lost our first guy, and now, fuck, we are sort of, skin and bones still.
And I think there was a couple of things. I think by that stage I was a few years into the job, and so that initial novelty of being able to wear a different uniform and grow a beard and grow long hair and all that.
The exact reason everyone goes through selection.
Well, initially it seems important, and then you realise pretty quickly that it's. And I remember the first time I spray painted an M4. I mean, the first time I got an M4 rather than a Steyr. That's a point, and then you're spray painting it, and you're thinking, Jesus, if I spray painted my rifle back at the battalion, I'd be.
You'd still be on guard. You'd still be hanging out there.
Christ almighty, yeah. At age 42, I'd still be painting rocks out the front of headquarters. But so, I mean, all those things that with hindsight are ridiculously trivial. At the time, they signified that once again, I'd arrived at that sort of goal of mine, which had been a goal for a long time. And so that was great at the time. But come a few years in, when I was on my second trip, that initial shine of SOCOM had come off, and you'd recalibrated to that special operations environment, and it was fantastic. It was stimulating. It was great. Don't get me wrong, but it was no longer shiny. It was just your job.
Yeah.
And you realised that for all the good stuff, it was still fucking hard work, and it was tedious, and there was a lot of frustrations, even though they were significantly less than some other elements in the army. They were still there. And then once we started losing blokes, it was another realization that, hang on a sec, we're not bulletproof. Like this, and I think the other thing that kind of hit me the hardest was not only are we not bulletproof, but it's not that you're a good operator or a bad operator. You're just lucky or you're unlucky, and the blokes that were getting hit were some of our best guys, and they just were in circumstances that were just unlucky. They happened to step on something instead of stepping 2 centimeters to the right, and then they're dead. Or, a bullet goes through their head versus goes through their kit, and I think, you're getting shot at from a few hundred meters away, and the difference between that bullet hitting you and not is millimeters of aim or a breath of wind or these sort of things. And you start to think about that. And we had a couple of helicopter crashes, and I was in one helicopter that crashed after it had tried to extract us, and then couldn't gain altitude on the way out and crashed. And we all walked away from that. And then, there was other helicopter crashes that killed multiple people on board and mangled the rest. And you start to think, shit, you know what? That's just dumb luck that I was on this one and not that one.
Yeah.
And so I think that realization, coupled with the fact that I was, as a family, we'd had another child just before my second trip. So I had one kid when I went away the first time, and then he was a few years old, and then we just had our second son about 10 days before I deployed on my second trip. And so on the home front, I knew my poor wife was sort of struggling to raise these kids, and here I was doing somewhat of a selfish job that I loved. Like, it was pretty much just a camping trip with my mates, a bit of hunting thrown in there, but
bit of Hunger Games action.
Along those lines. But as I went along and sort of into my second, third, fourth trips, the weight of that started to really occur to me that this isn't just about me. Like, if I get killed on operations, I won't know anything of it, but I'm leaving behind a wife with a couple of young kids, eventually 3 young kids that they'll never know who I am. And, the scales start to tip. The novelty starts to come off it. The excitement in terms of it being new and shiny and a steep learning curve started to flatten out. And all the while, the other side of the scales was, well, people are getting killed here. We're playing for keeps. It's dumb luck whether it's them or me. it just depends on which helicopter you hopped on as to which one crashed and which one didn't. It's not.
Did you ever feel though, like leaving, that you were almost being, the most experienced medic on the ground with those guys, or one of the most experienced, that almost the feeling of I'm letting the guys down? Like if I'm not there, who's looking after the guys?
I didn't. I mean, in the early stage of my career, I had this, and once again, with hindsight, probably pretty arrogantly, I had this idea that I should be the guy there because I'm the highest trained bloke and I'm going to give the person on the ground the best chance of survival. And it wasn't until my third trip when it occurred to me that that's not the case, that I was, in my mind, massively underestimating the competence of the medics around me.
Yeah.
And that was a real fault, and I'm sort of, I'm embarrassed to admit that. And there was a couple of situations that happened on that rotation that made me realize this. And there was two specific jobs where I'd been on them, and the task group had been allocated two different missions on the same day. One was there was a mission against what they deemed to be a strategic communications tower over near the Pakistani border. And it was, the intelligence suggested that it was going to be heavily guarded, and it was a night mission. It was a winter job. And so anyway, long story short, there was that job. There was another job, which was a more routine vehicle mounted patrol. I put myself on the high risk thing, thinking that we were expecting casualties. Turns out we got in and out, and there was not a single shot fired. And the other job had a massive incident with one of their vehicles and a bloke critically injured. And the medic that responded to that did a brilliant job. Saved this guy's life, stabilised him, aeromedically evacuated him, got him back, and did it as well as, if not better than I could have. That was job one. The other one was a job where I had been on once again, a separate mission. I'd gone, done a thing, come back. We had another element out that was going against a Taliban heroin processing facility, and that had been rigged to blow. It was full of IEDs. The Talibs knew that we were going to come in and raid this thing eventually, so they'd rigged it, armed it as they went out the door. Our crew rolled in that night, got in there, started to sort of set the place to destroy all their stuff, and then someone initiated an IED, absolutely shredded one of our blokes, dropped him. The remaining crew fell back as they did, and then searched their way back in to make sure they were clear they weren't going to hit another device. By the time they got there, the guy that had been hit was showing no signs of life. One of my other medics was on the ground, and he responded, did his sequence perfectly, identified this guy had a thing called a tension pneumothorax, build up of pressure in his chest, and needled that, did another series of interventions, gave him an injection of a thing called tranexamic acid, which was the first time this stuff had been used in the field. It was just after we got approval to use it. And that stuff, in essence, reduces internal bleeding, is sort of the gist of what it does. But did these interventions perfectly, unquestionably saved this guy's life. And it was after those two events in pretty quick succession that it occurred to me, hang on a sec, I don't need to be on the ground. And not only that, as I said before, I am underselling these blokes that are working, that are working under my command. These guys can do this job. And at that stage, I realized that my best utility was not necessarily trying to be on every single job to be the guy there, but to make sure that I was ramping up as much training for as many people as I could as this force multiplier, because I started to see that a well-trained medic could do exactly what I could do, and that I wasn't as important as I thought I was previously, which was a good realization. And so, I mean, to come back to your question of did I feel like I was sort of letting the place down when I left? No, because I knew that these guys were incredibly competent and would be able to continue to operate without me there, and that I wasn't fundamental to that construct at all. They were the blokes that were fundamental, and the medical officer could come and go, and they had that core competence.
It says a lot about the unit when you can look, fuck, I faith. And look, to be honest, the amount of times you hear of CFAs, AFAs, everyone, because everyone's AFA, of course, but then CFAs and stuff doing some stuff, you're like, holy shit. Like, of course, it's within their realm. It's a lot to give a guy, and like, I remember doing needle T training and being like, it's a lot to give someone that. Like, that's years at fucking med school or anything for someone else to do that. Here you go, here's this needle that's 6 inches long or 8 inches long. If this happens, you see these signs, do it. And my very limited knowledge is almost, I remember doing my AMT course before deploying, and some of the nursing officers, medical officers, almost overthought some things. Like because of the skills we had, we had basic resuscitation, tension pneumothorax, so could administer a few drugs, and that was it. We'd drag someone in and go, okay, one side of the chest isn't lifting. I'm doing this. Needle. Where we almost had to reiterate to some people, like, well, this is all we can do. Like, oh, let's do a chest drain and this and that. And it was almost like, it was fucking brilliant. Of course, way better medicine, but it almost, the guys, the sort of, if you just know the specific steps and fuck it, like, just do it. And some of the stories of guys on the ground or every call, everything in Afghan was fucking amazing. Some of the shit that went down. And I think sometimes, and this is a bit of bias from me, but we almost put the special forces units in such a spotlight, and that's fantastic, as we should. But I think for infantry guys and everyone else attached, we shouldn't forget that if you hear some of the stories around the units, it's like, holy fuck. There's a story of my unit, with guys carrying guys hundreds of meters to get to a medical position through fire. And you're like, well, it's great to celebrate, these guys on the pinnacle in the SAS commandos, but in the day, these guys are just fucking awesome shit too. We all still bleed the same. A bullet does the exact same to me as it does to you, as to anyone.
Oh, you're spot on. And I think this is another trap. We spoke about social media and just seeing what you want to see and what they want you to see on social media and creating this false impression of what's going on. And I think the same thing happens with special forces, and I think we lose sight of the fact that anyone who ends up in one of those units has started at another unit. Like, they're the same fucking people. They've just done a course and got a bit more training. It's not like they've somehow been bred differently. They've just got a slightly different mission profile. But exactly as you say, that difference between a Australian infantry element and a special operations element is not significant at all. It's a different mission profile, a couple of different skill sets, some different kit, but in terms of measuring the blokes against one another, the difference would be trivial. And like you say, when the chips are down, shit, I'd happily be out on the ground with either a bunch of grunts or a bunch of SAS dudes. It's sort of inconsequential. You'd end up with the same caliber of bloke fighting on the ground, in my opinion.
And Aussies have shown that. Throughout the ages, Aussies again and again and again. Of course they have. Every fucking time you're like, holy shit! Like, you guys are fucking crazy. Especially in the jungle, fucking Aussies. And I think sometimes a lot of guys tend to lose a bit of morale because they do undersell themselves. Like, it's it's important to realise, if you look at other armies around the world, like, I know, doing a bit of work with the Marines, like, fuck, we're lucky some of the training and kit and everything, like, a basic infantryman has. I remember rocking up as a SIG attached to a Marine element, and they thought, like, oh, are you SF? And I'm like, no. And they're like, oh, but you've got double night vision and this body armor. And I'm like, oh, no. And they're like, oh, fuck that, you're lucky. And I think we Australians, as general soldiers, we're kitted out well. And the training, everything.
I think you're exactly right. And I think the caliber, it's the same as we've been talking about earlier with the perspective and what you're used to and calibrated towards. But I think the caliber of an Australian infantry soldier, when you look at it compared to the like forces of a lot of international nations, is right up there. Our grunts are right up there with the best of them.
Fucking oath. And probably one of the things I want to go over, and this is up to you whether we go or not, is sort of the most hectic tactical sort of medical scenario you've been put into. And whether the person ended up surviving or passing, or but sort of what went down,
Yeah, I mean, there was
or one that's really in your like that you really remember?
probably the most memorable was the first fatality that we had, that I was on the ground for, and was sort of the guy responsible for the medical response to, and that one happened. So we'd inserted on a target, and this was during my second tour of Afghanistan, and it was a known enemy stronghold, basically. Like it was we'd sort of, our task was to go in there and soften up this target and just try and make it vulnerable for another force to come in and sweep through this village, because they hadn't been able to penetrate in there. And so the goal was to go in and fight for 48 hours. So we'd insert one period of darkness and stay on the ground for 2 days, insert extract the 48 hours later. And we were working with the 160th, so the US Special Operations Aviation Regiment. So they put us in, and because we'd assumed that the second we hit the deck we were going to get lit up, and that was exactly what happened. So we'd planned it to land pretty close to this village, and there was a whole bunch of desert around it, and they put us in within about 200 meters of the village, and so we inserted 1 a.m, midnight, whatever else, middle of the night. And within about 15 seconds of hitting the deck, we had machine gun fire just pouring into our position, RPGs cracking overhead, and there was a fair bit of open ground between us and the village, and it was make best.
200 meters, you pricks.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that it was at Michael Johnson that holds the 200 meter world record.
It's now Dan Pronk.
Well, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, there was a platoon of blokes that broke that record that night with body armor on, but. Yeah. But no, we zipped into the sort of perimeters there and made our way into the village, and we had these designated compounds of interest and sort of fought our way in. And on that particular night, we had a couple of minor casualties, nothing significant. I think an RPG airburst over a couple of blokes, and there was some fragmentation, minor stuff. But we were pretty lucky. I think from memory, a bloke had a plate strike that night as well, but certainly no significant injuries. And anyway, there was a little bit of a lull at sort of 2, 3, 4 a.m. and then first light, it was go time. The whole village erupted on that first day, and spent that entire day just in a massive gunfight. Had a couple of Predator drones overhead all day, and Apache gunships, lots of gun runs, and lots of probing attacks from the enemy, but just basically a big sort of gunfight all day. No casualties that day. Middle of summer in Afghanistan, the temperatures were sort of mid to high 40s, and so we kind of had underestimated the fight that we were getting ourselves into, and we'd depleted our ammunition stores. Well, we hadn't depleted them, but we were running low on ammo, and we were there for a whole nother 24 hours, and we were running low on water actually as well. And so that night we had a C-130, a Hercules, come in, fly super low, and kick out a bunch of pallets of ammo and water. And so we resupplied in the night, and then once again the following day. And it turns out that the Taliban, they'd reinforced during the night as well. So they, through their Kharez systems, their underground systems, a bunch of other fighters had come in from out of town and reinforced. And we had also, there was a commando element in vehicles that had been on a different job, sort of not too far from where we were, and we'd realised that we'd kicked a bit of a hornet's nest, and so got in touch. The headquarters element got in touch and said, "Hey, do you reckon you guys can just come and set yourself up on the perimeter of this village and provide a bit of fire support?" And so they did just that. And so when it dawned, when day dawned the second day, and the gunfight started again, we had this a whole platoon of armoured vehicles sort of on the periphery of town. We were surrounded, which sounds far more dramatic than it was, but we were well fortified in our compounds, but we were getting attacked from every angle, and then there was this semicircle of armored vehicles sort of shooting in. We were shooting out,
Yeah.
and so it was sort of, and then we had the Apaches and the drones doing their runs as well, and so it was a real good, honest sort of shit fight. And on that second day, we started to take a few more significant casualties. So we had a couple of guys that were they were hit by a grenade, and they had some significant shrapnel wounds, one through the arms, the other down the side of his flank and his chest. And so I'd assessed those blokes, and we medically evacuated both of those because I thought that they might have. I just didn't know whether the one in the chest had gone into the chest cavity, and the one on the arm, it was suspiciously close to a couple of arteries. So we got them out. Pretty shortly after that, a bloke copped a bullet in his vest, so he got hit square in the chest and was pretty lucky to get away with that. And then there was an RPG fragmentation wound. Another guy got a big chunk blown out of the front of his shin, and it fractured his shin. And we evacuated that guy.
By evacuation, what is that seen at the time? Is that airlifted out?
Yes.
Or by, yep.
Yeah. So called in some aeromedical evacuation helicopters, so Black Hawks, to come in with Apache escorts.
Yeah.
And so it was pretty dodgy getting those birds in. And
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, to their credit, the AME crews, I never had an experience where they didn't come.
Were they Yank PJs in them?
They weren't PJs. So we did have, I mean, the PJs, pararescue jumpers, were certainly flying AME missions and SASR type stuff in Afghanistan. But on that particular day, it was dust off. So regular Army aeromedical evacuation platforms in Black Hawks. And so we'd had Apaches do gun runs and just sort of suppress the targets, and then they'd come sort of screaming in and flare and slam down, and we'd chuck our casualties on, and they'd nick off. And I've actually got helmet camera footage of one of the handovers. It was for the two grenade blokes, and normally the flight medic would hop off the bird and sort of come and get a handover, and you know, you'd try and give him a bit of information. And that was, on that day, watching it back, as the dodgiest handover I ever got. That bloke wasn't getting off the helicopter. They just sort of slammed this thing in. We chucked the blokes off. I yelled at him at 2 sentences, and then they were off.
Yeah.
They didn't want to stick around. But so we'd done all that, and come early afternoon, sort of mid-afternoon, actually it was, we'd had an element move forward. We'd been getting fairly heavily engaged from a couple of machine gun positions, which were about 150 metres in front of kind of our forward line of our troops, if you like, and the position I was in, and one of our platoon headquarters was in. And there was a 4-man patrol that moved forward to try and clear those positions. And they'd been engaged as they moved forward. They were moving along a creek line. They'd been engaged. They'd shot back. They'd dropped one of the enemy and wounded another, and they were following that wounded enemy. So they were following a blood trail into this enemy series of compounds where there was the machine gun positions, and they ended up moving forward. And sadly, the lead bloke initiated a massive IED, so he stood on a device, and it went up and shrapned one of the other guys fairly badly, and then blew up the other 2 guys of the patrol quite badly as well. And in the confusion of it all, the other 2 blokes that had been blown eardrums and sort of knocked off their feet, but otherwise not injured, had gotten up. There was a guy who had significant shrapnel wounds to his neck, and he was conscious and you know, making a bit of noise, and they had dragged him back into a compound, and then regrouped and realised that the 4th bloke wasn't with them, had gone out under heavy fire and recovered him and dragged him back. And the bloke who actually went out and grabbed him ended up with a Medal of Gallantry for that, because he exposed himself to heavy gunfire to recover his wounded mate. Dragged him back. We had realised that something had gone wrong, and the radio calls came through that they had a significant casualty or casualties. So I plugged into a quick reaction force, about half a dozen blokes, plugged in with them, and we moved forward to where they were. So we were about 150 metres dislocated from our elements. The enemy knew that we were pinned down. They knew we had casualties, some of which were significant. And so we had got back into this compound and sort of set up a roof team and the roof team was immediately engaged. And so the enemy was trying to get in, and we were trying to desperately stabilise the two blokes that were the worst injured. The one that initiated the device was very, very badly injured, and the other guy had these neck wounds that were bleeding quite badly. And this, at this stage, the light was starting to fade, so it was sort of getting a bit darker. We were dislocated from our enemy, from the element. The enemy were probing us. We had this really critically injured guy and another guy fairly badly injured, and it was just a really tough situation. And ultimately, despite our best efforts, we were losing the guy who initiated the device, and he started to lose signs of life, and so we started initiating higher order resuscitative measures, which I guess in my heart of hearts I knew was futile, and ultimately had to make the decision that this situation was deteriorating rapidly. We'd called an aeromedical evacuation platform, and it was in a holding pattern, and it was running out of fuel, so it was going bingo. And we had a time pressure to get our guys who we could put on the AME bird to the extraction site. We were very aware that the enemy was moving in on us, and saw this as an opportunity to attack us as a dislocated element with bogged down with a couple of casualties. And so ultimately I had to make the decision to cease our resuscitative efforts of the bloke who initiated the device, who really, in that context, there was no saving him. Sadly, he was just too badly damaged, and just package him up, turn our attention to the other three blokes, and just make sure we all fell back safely and didn't sustain any more casualties. Got back to our element, and then evacuated the other guys, and that was one where it was the first time I had been I'd been a doctor for a while at that point, and I'd been involved in resuscitations where people had died, but it was almost universally, I was part of a team. I wasn't the team leader. It was a civilian context where the person dying was a stranger. And so you can remove yourself from that. That's easy, relatively speaking, to remove yourself emotionally from. But this was the first time where I was the guy everyone was looking to do the business. This bloke was a friend of mine that was loved and respected amongst that community. He was a legend amongst that community, and I didn't, it was on me, and I didn't have the skill set to be able to deal with that, or I couldn't resolve that situation. I went through my processes and they just weren't working, and so that was a tough one to sort of rationalize in my mind, and that was one that really played on loop for years, to be honest with you. And then sort of sadly, within 6 weeks of that, I sort of found myself in the field for another two blokes getting killed, another one that I'd worked on for about 40 minutes, and then a third one who was killed instantly, but we had to recover his body, so we didn't do any medical interventions on him. But it was just this really rough period for the task group as a whole, and for myself personally, that just really redefined how I saw the role, and redefined. It was formative for me professionally and personally. With hindsight, it was a real turning point for me.
Yeah. Does it ever? Because I know even I have little bits like this, and of course I've never lived through anything like that. Looking back on things like that, does it ever feel like that didn't exist? Like now you're in such a civilian life, you know, you're back in Adelaide with wife and kids, and you're sitting here with me, and we're having. Do you ever look back and think, fuck, No, surely not. Like I know, I think back, and it's only a few years back to Afghan, and whatever. I'm like, nah, I'm such a different person now
Yep.
than then. That wasn't like it. Almost seemed like a dream that didn't actually happen. Has that ever happened
Yeah,
to you?
yeah. It absolutely. Sometimes I sort of catch myself thinking about it, and it's more like a movie that I watched than something I actually experienced. And I guess for years afterwards, I would have a physical response to those memories. My palms would sweat. My heart would go, and all those typical sort of things. And but then that went away, and then the years pass, and you go from thinking about it multiple times a day, and dreaming about it and all the rest, to not having any response when you do think about it, to then realizing, shit, I haven't thought about that for 6 weeks, and so I mean, which is great. It's part of the normal healing process. But yeah, you're quite right. I in my day-to-day life today, it is so far removed from any of that stuff. I look at photos of myself then, and I hardly recognize myself, and I think about those situations, and the thought of being in combat is just so foreign to me now that it is almost like that was, like I said, a movie that I watched or a dream that I had rather than something I actually did.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it, that you
Yeah.
can live sort of different lives,
Yeah.
and it's so taken away from it. Like right now, we couldn't be further away from
Oh.
that, and it's somewhere in the world that's happening. Like, but I think it is important to open and close chapters of life, and
Yep.
you don't forget those chapters, of course, but
No.
you got to. I'm not saying move on, but at some point you move forward with life. It still
Yeah.
exists, it still matters. You just got to move on through it.
I like the concept of evolving, and I think it's, you're never going to forget that sort of stuff, and you shouldn't.
No.
However, you shouldn't dwell on it or live in the past, because there's no future there. And I've come to look at this from the perspective of the blokes who did die, who I worked on and I couldn't save. And I honestly believe that they wouldn't want me to sit around feeling sorry for myself or feeling bad for them. They just weren't that kind of blokes. Just like,
Yeah, but I think none of you guys are that kind of
No,
guy.
that's
either.
exactly
If
right.
you
And I think,
died,
well,
you'd be like, lads, get over
yeah.
it. Go have a beer for me and then fuck off.
spot on.
Like,
And I'm sure that's your sentiment exactly. I mean, it was a great sort of experience to live through the passing of my dad, which is a weird thing to say, but I mean, we were lucky with Dad. He had lung cancer, and so we had a period of time there where we knew that he was dying, but had the chance to process that. It wasn't a sudden death. And Dad was a very philosophical sort of bloke, and not particularly religious, but well, not religious at all,
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
in any sense of the term. But he was very sort of, cut and dry. He was a heavy smoker his whole life, and it was sort of logical to him. Yep, I smoked, now I have cancer, and I'm going to die. But our family was very lucky in the way that we had very open lines of communication. We were very aware that we respected each other. We spoke to each other often. We told each other we loved them. There was nothing left unsaid. And so I guess with Dad, he was very adamant that he didn't want his death to be this tragic event. He wanted his funeral to be a celebration of his life rather than a mourning of his death. And that's exactly what it was. It was this overwhelmingly positive experience, his funeral. It was this sort of, what an amazing opportunity to show gratitude to everything that this man had done to everyone for everyone in the room. And so it was just this sort of fantastic celebration of his contribution to all of our lives, and sort of just sending him on to the next world rather than, oh, this is horrible, he's gone. And coming back to the guys that died in the field, they were true warriors, and they loved every second of doing what they did. There was nowhere they would have rather been, and to be killed in that role was a reality of what they were doing. They knew that.
Yeah.
And we all knew that. I suppose whether you know it in theoretically and then you actually really know it, it's probably two different things. However, the fact remains that they weren't the kind of blokes that would have felt sorry for themselves, and I don't think they were the sort of blokes that would have expected anyone responding to them to do their absolute best, which we did. However, if it didn't work out well, then they wouldn't have wanted us to dwell on that. They would have wanted us to I think move on with our lives and live a full life that sort of honoured their sacrifice rather than just mourning it. And by that same token, I mean when I look at the horrendous injuries that bloke that I was talking about had sustained, and talking to close mates of his after the fact, it would have been a very different life and a very challenging life, and for him to live and so far removed from the high functioning sort of physically vital bloke that he was, that whether he would have wanted to go on as that person, it's hard to say. But yeah, anyway,
yeah, it's another world, isn't it? It's the life of an SAS trooper, right? But I don't think anyone ends up in that role not coming to the realization of, well, that's part of this job. You're dealing with life and death on both sides, I guess, so flippantly. At the same token that you guys have gone into a village, or a compound where life and death is so apparent, ending, and and I guess in your life, the life and death you've seen has made you who you are. The biggest thing I get from your book, and knowing you, as a personal mate of mine, is you reiterate everything about family.
Yeah,
it's throughout everything.
Yeah,
and I think part of the post-traumatic growth, to a degree, is you've dealt with death so much that you appreciate life so much. And I think it's a truly beautiful moment when you were saying you're at the front of that, and we talked about earlier in this, out the front of a restaurant with your newly born child, and and I think almost the seeing death makes you appreciate life more. And that's it's sort of that you need that. It's the dark backing that makes a mirror, show you who you are.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and I think we spoke about it earlier, that strange, almost paradoxical sounding statement that those horrendous experiences are your best ones, but it's very true in that it does take your blinkers off with regards to appreciating what you've got. And I'm now in a position where I'm just so gracious towards my wife, my family, and just appreciative of what I've got there, and my life in general, my role in society, my job. They're all gifts that were previously assumed, but now I really appreciate. And I think that's, to have your eyes open to that is a really it is a gift.
I think opening your eyes to your own mortality in general does a lot. I know my own, sort of opening my eyes to mortality of my own has made me love a lot more. Like you mentioned with your family, nothing goes unsaid. I tell a lot more people I love them now than I ever did. I hug a lot more people than I ever hugged. And it's honestly made me a better person.
There's a lot of the peripheral bullshit in life that just falls away when you're sort of faced with those realizations. You sort of think all the stuff you used to think was important is really not, and it allows you to focus on the stuff that actually is important.
Yeah, and one of the ways I look at it, sort of finding happiness because I struggled, and I think a lot of people do, to live in the now. We tend to live in the past or the future. That things will get better in the future, or they were better in the past instead of now. I refer back to a lot of an author, Sam Harris. He's a a neuroscientist and an astrophysicist. Anyway, he does a lot of work on like finding meaning in life if you're not spiritual at all.
Yeah.
Anyway, he talks about sort of the basic, very, very basic things of like quantum physics. Says that pretty much anything we can interact with exists for you and me. Right here, you and me cannot prove anything outside this room exists. And he calls them frames of reference.
Yep.
And he talks about to find happiness in a moment is you need to break that frame of reference. So no matter what's happening in your or my life, I might have stresses that I'm going to see a doctor somewhere. And he goes, break that frame of reference. And if you think of your frame of reference on a universal, like a universe size, you're not smart enough to. You think on a global size, it'll annoy you because you'll think of everything from global warming and what's happening in Afghanistan now and in Syria. And you break it down to your community, then you might break it down that you're not enjoying it. Break it down to the point of like the most private moment you're having. So break your frame of reference down. So right now, it's Willy and Dan. That should not right here, right now. Nothing outside of this room exists in the world.
Yeah,
and that's how he talks about it. And the funny thing is, there's actually a lot of science to back up that. But to break that down, and I think a lot of those key moments you're talking about, that the most terrible moments can almost be in the best one. That if you're there, doing resuscitation with a mate of yours who makes it, doesn't make it, at that moment, at that second in time, nothing else existed for you and him.
Yeah.
To you, he was the most important person in your life, and to him, you were as well.
Yep.
Yes, there's bullets flying around, but at that moment, it's you guys.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And this sort of circles back to that whole flow state and that in the zone, if you like. And as much as I refer to those situations as being terrible, and they were, the outcome was terrible, my feeling at the time was not one of terror or fear or sort of profound sadness. I was at that exactly as you said, I was so engaged in the moment and so absolutely in that zone that they were actually really, for me personally, quite sort of, I guess, well, stimulating in a way, but very calm experiences of flowing through my processes, doing my procedures. It was almost on autopilot, just kind of going through there. And there was a lot of other examples that I experienced over there where I did go into this strange, calm state where there was a lot of stuff going on around me, a lot of noise, a lot of gunfire, casualties and all the rest of it. But my world went really calm and quiet, and a couple of times where my world slowed, I lost perspective of time, which is, once again, they talk about this, what they call hypofrontality, where different circuits in your brain start to slow down and shut down, and you go into that flow state and lose track of self and time and all the rest of it. And so you're exactly right. Those experiences are very rich for a lot of reasons. I mean, they're very engaging, and in that exact moment, nothing outside of that sort of 1 square meter around me mattered or existed. And thank goodness there was someone up on the roof worrying about people trying to come into our compound or shoot at us, because I certainly wasn't thinking about that, and I was consumed in that moment. And that happened a number of times in Afghanistan, and it was for me, they were very positive experiences to have, but the outcome of the situations was often very negative. And so, when you come out of that and look back, you think, geez, that was a bad day. However, I didn't feel bad in that situation, and that in itself can create a bit of kind of confusion, because there's been situations where there's been a horrendous outcome in a medical scenario, a couple I can think of with local nationals, where the outcome was poor and people died. However, I'd gone through processes that were professionally satisfying for me and were a challenge to my skill set and went well in certain casualties, whereas others didn't. And so, I mean, the end result was a bad one. There was lots of dead people at the end of the day, but I walked away from it thinking, gee, that was awesome. And then you sort of think, who are you? Like, how can you walk away from that situation thinking you've had a good day when all these, and so it creates confusion there. But But so yeah, I mean, it, I guess, takes time to process all of that stuff.
It's a weird thing. And how do you deal with in a civilian, like, in Australia with death now as a doctor?
Look, I mean, I guess you get pretty comfortable with the concept as a whole. I had the opportunity when I was working up at that little hospital up in Queensland to do a fair bit of palliative care. So we had an inpatient facility, a ward facility, and a couple of the beds were palliative beds. And I found myself really enjoying that work. I hadn't ever expected to. I had no exposure to it. It was so far removed from what I'd loved prior to that, which was the tactical medicine, the sort of pointy end, point of injury, big injuries, test your skills against these dying people. But then I found myself in this environment with these end stage cancer patients, the people in their late phase of their life. But that was a really privileged position to be in, to be invited into that, what is a very, very intimate family dynamic, and then to be able to negotiate that both with the patient and sort of negotiate with them as to what their expectations are, what the medical reality is, what you can and can't do, and then the family as a broader construct, all of which bring their individual opinions, and the family dynamics are always massively amplified when you're in these sort of situations, and so to be a doctor as in the middle of all of that was a really unique experience, and I found a very gratifying one if you could do it well. And so in terms of my view on death from that perspective, to be able to facilitate some of these patients like a painless and dignified death was a real privilege and a positive experience for me in that regard. I still see certain deaths as tragic. You still see little kids taken before their time, or horrible accidents, or whatever else, and that's a tragedy. There's no two ways about it. I haven't been desensitized to the fact that death is a tragic thing in certain situations. However, I certainly don't view deaths like I mentioned my father passed away a couple of years ago, and that didn't sadden me profoundly, which might sound a bit callous, but that was for the fact that he'd lived a full life, and we had that time towards the end of his life. Although if he had died quicker, and I mentioned this in my book, I don't think it would have mattered, because there was nothing that was left unsaid. He knew that I loved him, I knew that he loved me, and we had this fantastic relationship. He had lived to a point where he'd seen both his sons grow up and establish themselves, have families of their own. He'd met his grandkids, and he'd set my mum up for the rest of her life. So he'd done his part, and I would have loved for him to kick on for another 20 years, no two ways about it. But the fact that he passed at that age, he'd lived a full life, and so I didn't view that as sad. And so for those sort of grandparents dying and elderly dying, I don't see that as particularly sad. But yeah, like I said, I haven't been completely desensitized to the tragedy of young people dying.
Of course, and I think that reacts a little bit with myself. A lot of people go, "Oh, how can you be, so okay and happy with your prognosis diagnosis?" I'm like, well, no, and I'm not shitting you. If I were to, step outside tonight and get run over by a fucking bus, no shit. Yes, there's goals I want to achieve. Fucking oath there are. But I feel like I've done a lot, and this is, like you said, affects me with young people. Is I look at these kids in a chemo clinic or something, I'm like, you've never had sex, you've never travelled Europe, you've never had a job, you've never been to school. That's what gets to me about that. And I think I'm so happy with my own mortality that I'm almost, and I think if you're not at the stage where you're like, well, look, if I died tomorrow, I'm pretty fucking happy with what I've done. I'm not saying there's not things we burn to do, like you mentioned, You mentioned the book that you saw on a skilled athlete shirt first. The comfort is a slow death.
Yes.
Of course, I think you should always be, sort of got that fire burning to do next things. And I see with guys like yourself, you'll be 85 in a palliative care in a hospital bed going, yeah, but I want to still do this, eh? And I think that's just human nature for people. But you need to look back on big events and like, yeah, well, I've done it. And that's why I hate bucket lists. I get goals. I hate bucket lists. I think if you want to skydive, there's nothing stopping an Adelaide person to go to Lower Light Skydive tomorrow with Alan and go jump out of a fucking plane. Same with if you want to go to France, go, because the way Sam Harris puts it is every human knows we are one drive, one hospital visit, one something of either dying or getting told we're dying. We know that's coming.
Yep.
We don't know when, but we know it is coming.
Yeah.
So if you do know that, then, don't be silly with your time.
Oh, I think, you're exactly right. And I mean, even if you don't know that, don't be silly with your time, I think. And I suppose it's that happy medium. You hear those kind of mantras, live every day as if it was your last type thing, which is unrealistic.
Yeah, exactly.
You'd go and clear out your bloody bank account.
You'd be broke.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you'd wake up the next day not dead.
It'd be a fucking big night for us.
With a McLaren in the car park that you don't know how the
Good day, but
how the fuck to pay off. But I guess by that same token, spending your days dwelling on things that happened 9 years ago or living that victim mentality, why me type thing, you're missing that opportunity to make the most of what you've got left if there is an ultimatum somewhere there. But like you said, ultimately we're all dying. It's just a matter of time, and whether it happens suddenly or gradually over a period, life's precious. You can't get it back. And so trying to make the most out of each of those days, being present, is something I'm very aware of, particularly with my kids, having missed a lot of their early years when I was away. Not dragging any of my bullshit from work home to sort of take out on them, having those transitions where I might have had a bad day at work, which is pretty rare these days, to be honest. I'm very lucky, but driving home and thinking, well, who's the best version of myself that needs to walk through that door? And even if I've got something on my mind, sort of stopping to think before I get in the door and see my kids and my wife, well, hang on a sec, it's I don't want to drag this into my house with me. I need to just leave this mood here and snap into being the dad that my kids want me to be when I walk through that door, the husband that my wife wants me to be when I walk through that door, and just that mindfulness, if you like, and that ability to be present and to consciously transition and be the best version of yourself for whatever the situation dictates is a massive thing for me. And it's been a huge positive in my life over the last couple of years to just gain that skill.
Yeah, and that's a very powerful statement. Sort of not drag on shit with you. Like, that person was an asshole to you in the street. He's not at home with you and your kids. And I think living in that moment is something it's not easy to do. But it is something I've really been trying to do more and more, is get purely in, like, living you and me. And then if I go out later for someone with coffee, it's me and them. Like, why bother with other shit? And you'll be a lot happier for that moments of time. You'll be fucking way happier.
Yeah.
So it's nearing the end of this. We're 2 hours and 58 minutes in now.
Bloody hell, mate.
Yeah, I know.
Time flies.
Yeah, fucking oath it does. What's next for yourself? Where do you see in the next coming years?
Yeah.
As far as career, professionally, anything?
It's a fair question. So the role I'm currently in it's a medical management role. So I've moved not completely away from clinical, but I've embraced more of the managerial side of medicine, which has created a new set of challenges. And I guess I have felt and do feel the need to constantly evolve, if you like. I mentioned that term earlier, but I like to challenge myself. I don't like to get too comfortable for too long in a particular role. And so this, over the past few years, I've been developing that managerial skill set as it applies to medical services. And And so I've enjoyed that challenge. And the current role I'm doing, I'm almost 2 years into it, and so I'm still on that learning curve there. So there's still some good stuff there to work through. I've got a couple of entrepreneurial side projects, which one of which I can't talk about in great detail because I haven't finalized all the intellectual property for, but that one's about to go loud. I've been working, I've been working for 2 years on that.
Oh, Jesus.
And I've got the first, actually sitting on my desk at home, the first finalized pre-production prototype of this device that we've been working on. And so for anyone who's sort of has a look at my Instagram once in a while, that'll pop up on that sometime soon, as I've secured that
I'm fucking excited now.
Oh, yeah, so am I. I wish I could talk more about it. But
no, that's fine. Just means you've got to come back in a couple of months.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'd love to. And the other one so I've been working on a car project for a long time, which I sort of have put out in the public space. I've founded this company many years ago, which is building a prototype sports car.
Yep.
And so it is moving along slowly but surely. And so that keeps me very engaged from an entrepreneurial perspective, those two projects. TACMed is doing wonderful things. So that's moving ahead nicely. And we've sort of split off a sister company called Payon Medical, which is doing medical services, which is starting to grow. And then we've moved into virtual reality. And so Jeremy, the founder, has been very proactive in developing a first responder virtual reality training program. And so that's starting to gain some traction as well. So there's a whole bunch in that space that's incredibly interesting for me as well. And so, I've got this very happy mix of my current work, which is engaging in the medical management space, and then these entrepreneurial side projects in very different things, and then still that in engagement in the tactical medical piece with TACMed. So it's a good round, and then of course my family, and that keeps me pretty busy. So that's me for right now. As to where it all heads, it'll depend on the success or otherwise of some of this entrepreneurial ventures, to be honest.
Yeah, well, fucking, I would say fingers crossed for you, but it's a hard work thing, and I'm sure it's been fucking put in.
We'll see. Yeah,
I'm fucking excited to see.
Yeah. Either way, I mean, coming back to what we said earlier, these were thoughts that I had and plans that I made many years ago, and the one of which is sort of after 2 years coming to fruition to the point where I'll be able to put it out on the market, and either it'll take off or it'll flop. One or two things, but I won't look back in 10 years thinking, oh, I wonder if I could have. And then the car is almost like my new sort of SAS selection project. It's gonna drag on for probably the best part of a decade. But
fuck, do you have a name? Do you have a name for the car yet?
I do, mate. Yeah, so Delta Automotive Industries is the company, and the car, the prototype's called the Ligero. So Delta Ligero is
it better than your Lambo?
Well, I don't know. How do you find better? The Lambo's in the shop at the moment, so we'll wait and see what that costs. But it'll be faster than theLambo. Yeah,
that classifies enough for me.
All right. Yep. Better then.
I'm secretly like a fucking 10-year-old boy when it comes to cars.
Oh, we all are.
I'm like, as long as it sounds good and it's quick, I'm set.
Yep.
Easy. Well, look, to be honest, I think we're done. Unless there's anything else you want to go over, like.
I think that covers it, mate.
Yeah, I think that covers it all. And honestly, mate, I can't tell you how much I appreciate.
Pleasure.
And not only you coming in tonight to be on my podcast, but the behind the scenes stuff as well. Of what was it? It'd almost be 18 months ago now when I knew of you. I had no idea who you were. Next thing I tagged in a video of you, like, let's support this bloke. And I can't, at that point in my life, I honestly can't tell you how much that meant to me. That's a pretty fucking low point. And in the same day, I had guys I probably had 20 operators, well-known guys, all hit me up, yourself included. And no shit, that fucking lifted a lot off me, thinking, well, fuck, it's not only me, with support, it's everyone.
Oh, awesome, mate. Gee, that's thank you for saying that.
No, I still look back at that. I watched it actually yesterday. I watched that video of yourself in what do you call your bar? The Blue
Blue Voodoo Lounge.
The Blue Voodoo Lounge.
Yeah.
I only yesterday looked back at that and I'm like, holy fuck, that was a fucking turning point in my life of like shit. And then I know my Instagram sort of got some traction off yours, like piggybacked off yours, and I was like, fuck, like almost now I feel a bit responsible to keep this going for people. Like, honestly, I sound like I'm blowing smoke up your ass, but I can't appreciate it. You more coming in and speaking openly and, you know, behind the scenes shit.
It's an absolute pleasure, and it's great to engage. And we spoke about it earlier, and I suppose these false impressions you get of people online, and I'm no different. I just put up some shit that people perceive as whatever they want. You know what I'm saying? And at the end of the day, we all sit down to shit, and it was fantastic for me to be able to reach out to yourself, and I look to you as a true inspiration. I mean, holy shit, and talking about we have our bad days. I mean, and I don't have many these days. Like I said before, I'm kind of looking at life from a different perspective, but fucking hell, mate, I look at your situation and look at your positivity in the face of what's going on, and I'm in awe, mate. That's incredible.
Oh, mate, trust me, it means a fucking lot to me having someone like you say it to myself. I don't see it. I'm honestly, man, just doing what I can, you know. And I think a lot of people almost give me too much credit for what I do. Like at the same point, we talked about this earlier, that, you know, a lot of what I do, yes, it may be helping people, but it helps me.
Yeah.
You know, these charity fundraising, and although of course it's something I believe in 100%, it helps me know that, well, look, I might not have been able to achieve in my life what I've wanted, but my legacy of this will continue on.
Yep.
So and my whole thing is that like 100 years down the 50, 100 years down the track, I want someone to take their kid in and they've got a fucking astrocytoma in the brain.
Yep.
And like, the doctor goes, oh, well, actually we have this drug that does this. And then I don't even care if they think it, but at some point, this fuckhead flipping tires down Semaphore Beach had some contribution to that. And that's honestly enough for me. Like that's it.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a big deal. And I think you're on that trajectory. I mean, the way that tire flip gained traction internationally is phenomenal. So,
well, I'm starting filming early next week for it again. It'll be out late next week. It'll be out to go again late October.
Brilliant.
So should be epic.
Good on you. I think what you're starting here is something huge.
Yeah, we'll see how we go.
Excellent.
So Dan, again, and everyone else, especially actually for those who dropped in live, there were people who watched the whole thing like 3 and a bit of hours.
Yeah, bloody hell, that's hard work.
That is hard work. Fucking oath. Go
to bed, guys.
Go and drink. We're all going to the bullshit. So Dan, thank you so much, brother.
Pleasure.
You're a legend. Cheers.
Cheers, mate.
So for everyone listening for the podcast on either Spotify, Google Podcast, and especially those on YouTube or live watching, thank you so much. This was episode 15 with Dan Pronk, a hero of mine, should be a hero of yours. So cheers and thanks again.
Cheers, guys.
And